See this place on the map? Yeah, right there. It's estimated that around 100 people have vanished or lost their lives here. Why, you ask? Well, it seems they were all looking for this guy, Percy Fossett. He was a British colonel, famous for his sharp blue eyes, perfectly groomed beard, and signature hat. He looked like a character from Pride and Prejudice, but lived more like Indiana Jones. In fact, this character was inspired by Fossett's story. But his disappearance in 1925 was more macabre than any movie plot. Colonel Fossett was bold. Not the ask-your-neighbor's Wi-Fi password kind of bold. I'm talking full-on, I don't care that much about my life bold. He used to be a soldier in Sri Lanka, and even did a secret spy gig in Morocco, but he needed more. So in 1906, Fossett started exploring parts of Brazil and Bolivia where no one had dared to go before. His mission was to create secret, mind-blowing maps. Okay, that doesn't sound too risky, but trust me, it was. If you want to explore the world nowadays, you just open Google Earth and, well, that's it. No danger, no adrenaline, just maybe one or two creepy street view photos. Ew. But we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, when satellites and this weird Google car didn't exist. Back then, if you wanted to fill in the world map, you actually had to explore the land on foot. So that's how Colonel Fossett ended up in South America. And he became famous for his expeditions to map out the wild Amazon. He was the first guy to record the locations of waterfalls in that region, for example. But then he got obsessed. Blame it on lack of sleep or whatever sketchy Amazon jungle juice he was sipping, but suddenly he was like, I'll bet there's an ancient advanced city hidden somewhere around here. Spoiler alert, there wasn't. But he was hooked on that idea. Hanging out with native Indians for so long convinced him that large groups could totally thrive in the middle of a massive rainforest. And of course, Fossett loved a good old adventure story, especially the ones from the 16th and 17th centuries, written by European explorers. In those stories, adventurers claimed they had found huge settlements and fine roadways deep in the heart of Latin America. But Fossett's all-time favorite story came from a manuscript written in 1753. Back then, adventurers were hunting for precious metals in Brazil when they stumbled upon a ruined city with monumental buildings, roads, and plazas. Oh, and every corner had a Roman-style spire. Naturally, the colonel was all in to find it. Too bad no one told him this manuscript is mostly considered a forgery. Yep, this story is as real as Snow White's. But then, things got weird. The settlement described in that manuscript was supposedly located in the northeast side of Brazil. But now, he's saying there's an advanced civilization in Mato Grosso, which is in a different part of the country. So he decided to name this new place the City of Z. Back in the 1920s, the colonel launched 2 separate expeditions to find it. But both trips failed, as he faced terrible weather, fever, and of course, exhaustion. Now, tell me in the comments, what do you think Fossett did after 2 failed expeditions? Option A, he quit. Option B, he called his mom. Option C, he tried again because he didn't get the memo that the universe is clearly saying stop. Well, of course, option C is the right answer. This is relentless Fossett we're talking about. So, 3 years later, the colonel finally gathered enough cash to launch yet another expedition in search of the City of Z. All he needed was a crew of people crazy enough to join him. Famous and experienced explorers were begging to come along. But nope, Fossett decided to take his son and his best buddy instead. In January 1925, this brave trio set off on their journey. They packed mosquito nets, canned food, and made a promise, we shall return. Another spoiler alert, they didn't. Uh-oh. The journey kicked off in New Jersey, and then they sailed pack animals like horses and hired a couple of local guides. Now they were ready to head to the city of Cuiabá. Now keep in mind the distances in Brazil are crazy huge. So this little journey was like traveling from Miami to Chicago on foot. 3 months later, they finally ventured into the jungle for the first time. And that's when the fun really began. The crew faced piranha-infested rivers, an endless maze of thick trees, and the worst part, bugs. The constant annoying zzz of a gazillion mosquitoes wouldn't let them sleep. and Fossett's best friend's foot got huge from tick bites. But the Colonel didn't have time to babysit his friend's princess foot. Oh no, he was too obsessed to take a break. In fact, at some point, he was so far ahead of his companions that he had to camp alone for a night. On May 29th, Fossett finally came to his senses. There was no City of Z. But did he let that stop him? Not really. He unpacked their gear and sent the local guides back to Cuba. But before saying a final goodbye, he asked them to deliver a letter to his wife, saying something like, "Don't worry, hon, our son is well and getting stronger every day." Sure he was. Anyway, after this dramatic farewell, the trio set off into the bush alone. The darkness swallowed the thick forest, and then they were never seen again. Okay, that was intense, so let's fast forward. 2 years later, the newspapers were still speculating whether the trio could still be alive, and Fossett became a legend, like Bigfoot, but less hairy. One guy said that the Colonel had become one of the locals and was living his happily ever after in the jungle. Another guy said he was held prisoner by the Indians, but no one could confirm any of these sightings. It wasn't until 1928 that the British authorities finally thought better late than never and decided to look for Fossett and his crew. By that time, they were sure their expedition had perished, but they still needed proof. And after days and days of surviving the jungle's worst nightmares, they found, well, nothing. But in a weird way, this mystery inspired more explorers to look for them. It's estimated that about 100 people have passed away in this process, and a few have followed in the explorers' footsteps by disappearing without a trace. So, what really happened to the expedition? Researchers have pointed their fingers at everything under the sun: parasitic infections, starvation, drowning, jaguar attacks, you name it. Some even say Fossett dove headfirst into mysticism and started an occult community in the jungle. The Brazilian anthropologist Orlando Vilas-Boas was probably the one who got the closest to solving this case. Back in the 1950s, he was working with the Kalapalo Indians when they suddenly admitted to, getting rid of Fossett. They even had bones to prove it. But it turns out a forensic analysis showed that the remains didn't belong to the Colonel. So we're back to square one, and nobody knows, to this day, whatever the heck happened to them. Fossett's quest, as we know it today, is based on some pretty questionable sources. But there is a possibility that he wasn't living in Delulu land after all. Recent discoveries suggest that his idea of a sophisticated jungle city wasn't just pure fantasy. In 2024, a massive ancient city was found in the Amazon, hidden beneath dense vegetation. Evidence suggests it was built around 2,500 years ago, and it was surprisingly advanced, featuring houses and plazas, all connected by an incredible network of roads and canals. But this city was in a forest in Ecuador, not Brazil. So who knows? Maybe the legendary City of Z is still out there. Ooh.
Marriage is not only about happiness, mutual support, love, and friendship. Marriage is also about trials, crises, and storms. And this Swedish couple survived several storms during their honeymoon. Literally. Not screams, insults, and drama, but real hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. This is a really cinematic love story. Newlyweds against nature. Meet Erica and Stefan. They met in Stockholm while working on a joint project, parted, but started chatting with each other on social networks. Their long-distance communication lasted for several years before Stefan decided to ask the woman out on a date. And it's worth paying tribute. It wasn't a typical date in a restaurant or in a park. Stefan suggested that Erica fly with him to go diving in Egypt. They realized that they both loved to travel and finally fell in love with each other. After a fabulous wedding and the birth of a beautiful daughter, the couple decided to go on a 4-month honeymoon. The tour was impressive. From Sweden to Indonesia, then to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and China. They didn't expect that the trip would turn out to be a real adventure where safety was not guaranteed. At first, they got stuck at Munich airport. All flights were delayed because of a severe thunderstorm. In Bali, Indonesia, they went to a high mountain with their little daughter. a strong wind began to blow at the top. It tore off the roof of the tourist bus where our heroes were sitting. Fortunately, no one was injured, and there were no other problems. But at that moment, it was just a teaser of the coming disasters. The couple arrived in Australia, where a wildfire first started near the city of Perth. Stefan and Erica didn't want to cough up thick smoke, so they quickly left for the city of Cairns. It was during that period when a ferocious cyclone began there. The storm was so strong that the Australian Red Cross Service provided shelter for 2,500 people in the mall. And there, another problem began. Imagine 2,500 people in a big, hot room without electricity while a hurricane is raging around. Oh, and there were only 5 toilets in the entire building. How nervous do you think people were? Eric and Stefan recall that some guys started fighting because of stress. The tension was getting stronger, but fortunately, the mall guards kept the situation under control. Wildfires, hurricanes, it seems that something is missing. Oh yes, what about an earthquake? The couple faced 2 earthquakes during their honeymoon, one of which happened in Japan in 2011. They went through all this together with their little daughter. Just imagine how their daughter was amazed by all these adventures. Such a trip strengthened their marriage. Of course, after natural disasters, any domestic quarrel would seem like a mere trifle. Erica admitted that in crisis situations, Stefan fully justified her trust and behaved as she had hoped. Oh, how sweet. What if we create tours for married couples who are planning to divorce? Survive the storm, fire, earthquake, and flood together, and then think again whether you should leave each other. Imagine that you've gone through several natural disasters in your entire life. Now the question is, are you lucky because you've survived, or are you an unlucky person because you've run into such troubles? It depends on how you feel about it. For example, there's a woman, Dana Weiland, who lives in California. She has survived several disasters throughout her life and continues to smile. And more recently, she's faced another disaster, wildfires in her home state. But let's take it in order. In 2005, Dana Weiland lived in New Orleans, and if anyone doesn't know, that year, Hurricane Katrina destroyed many houses in this and other cities. Dana's house was no exception. According to her, the lower floor of the house was completely flooded with water. Of course, she had to give up everything and evacuate. Dana and her family drove to Texas to a friend's place for about 20 hours. 1 month later, Hurricane Rita arrived there, and Dana and her family evacuated again. It looked as if nature was following her around, but our heroine was not one of the timid ones. Several years later, she faced another disaster, Snowmageddon. This was when a huge amount of wet, cold snow flooded cities and roads. Strong wind, blizzard, and endless snowfall. All traffic stopped. The lights turned off. The streets were empty. Dana sat for 11 days without electricity during this snow apocalypse. And after all these disasters, she got the exact opposite of snow. Wildfires in her hometown of Lake Arrowhead in San Bernardino County. Let's hope that this time, everything will be fine with her again, and she will meet any adversity with a smile on her face. Have you heard that lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place? Can it hit the same person twice? What if it strikes the same guy 7 times in a few hours? This is not a movie plot in a tragicomedy genre. This is the real story of Roy Sullivan, a man who got into the Guinness Book of Records for the number of lightning strikes survived. There are more than 8 million lightning strikes on Earth every day, which is about 100 strikes per second. But even so, the probability of getting struck is extremely low, 1 chance in 10 million. For Roy Sullivan, these chances were too high. For his strange record, people nicknamed him the Human Lightning Rod. For the first time, lightning struck him in 1942, when Roy was on a watchtower that didn't have a lightning rod. A bright flash of light and a powerful current discharge scarred the man, but didn't cause crucial damage to health. The next accident occurred in 1969, when lightning struck a tree near the road. The lightning passed through the tree to a car. Guess who was driving this vehicle? Roy lost control and almost drove off a cliff. Fortunately, he stayed alive again. Okay, the first time he was on the tower during a thunderstorm. The second time was on the road next to a tree, and as we know, lightning often strikes trees. This meant Roy was in a potential risk area every time. But the third time happened in his front yard. Lightning struck the transformer and caught his shoulder. The fourth time happened in 1972. Lightning struck Roy while he was working. From that moment on, the man began to suspect that this natural phenomenon was somehow attracted to his body. Maybe it was a curse, or maybe everything could be explained from a scientific point of view. A year later, lightning struck him for the fifth time. A thunderstorm started that day. Roy decided not to try his luck again and hid in his truck. And so, when the storm calmed down, Sullivan got out of the car and bam! Another lightning strike. There were 2 times left before the record. They occurred in 1976 and in 1977. Roy's bad luck spread to his wife. One day, lightning struck her too. It didn't hurt her, but scared a lot. So far, no one has broken Ray's record, but obviously people haven't tried to do that. Okay, lightning, fires, snowstorms, hurricanes, and earthquakes. But how about tsunamis? Unfortunately, this is one of the most terrible and devastating disasters on the planet. If you survived it, you're definitely lucky. Zarul Fuadi from Indonesia survived these devastating water disasters twice. The first occurred in Indonesia in 2004. And the second happened a few years later during an earthquake in Japan. During the second time, Zarul was in the building on the 3rd floor and felt a jolt. He was shocked and immediately remembered the tsunami he had experienced before. The tsunami hit the city, but our hero and his family survived. After this double trouble, he decided to move to his homeland, Indonesia. Despite the terrible events, Zarul looks at what happened calmly. Any catastrophe can happen to any person at any moment, but it doesn't mean you should live in fear forever. So, he focused on the bright side of life. It was June 1928 when Mr. Keller almost lost his life in a terrifying natural disaster. He was outside with his family when he noticed an umbrella-shaped cloud that seemed to be approaching them. It gave him a sense of foreboding. A tornado was probably forming there. Indeed, in no time, 3 huge funnel clouds were dashing their way. After rushing his family into the storm cellar, Keller decided to have another look. And what he saw both terrified and mesmerized him. The twister was directly overhead, but inside the swirling cloud, everything was eerily still. The man could feel a strong, grassy smell. He had trouble breathing. He looked up and saw a circular opening right overhead. It was around 50 to 100 feet across and around half a mile high. Keller could clearly see the walls of the rotating cloud. Constant bursts of lightning zigzagged from side to side non-stop, illuminating this horror movie scene. The man could also see many smaller tornadoes forming and breaking free. A deafening, hissing noise was overwhelming. And the next moment, the tornado skipped over Keller's house and smashed the home of his neighbors. Mr. Keller wasn't the only person to see the tornado from the inside and live to tell the tale. But other survivors didn't end up as unscathed. It seemed to be a regular day when Chris Tuving from Dallas, Texas got to the Little Caesars in 2019. They had run out of pizzas, so he decided to wait. Well, it was a grave mistake. A powerful tornado hit the shopping mall where he was staying and pulled him out of the building. Chris managed to find a support column and held on for dear life. But no muscle strength could compare to the terrifying power of the tornado. Tuvang was lifted into the air and thrown into a truck parked in front of the restaurant. He tried to hold on to the hood, but there was nothing to grab. In the end, he managed to hold on to the rim of the left front tire and stay there until the whole nightmare stopped. The tornado Chris survived had sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and was 13 football fields wide at the base. Eric Simmons recalled taking cover from a tornado in May 2019 by climbing into his truck. Once inside, he looked out of his right windshield and saw vines growing along the fence. They were moving around in a bizarre way that confused the man. And then it all started. Suddenly, everything Eric could see was wind and pitch-black darkness. Then, a section of a roof flew over him and shredded apart mid-air. The truck's back windshield shattered, showering the man with shards of glass. A tree in front of him was lifted into the air like a twig, and the fence blew over the top of the truck. Simmons could feel the back of the vehicle lifting. He could see the power lines exploding right in front of his eyes. Even though the visibility was terrible, he could still see the flashes. It all lasted around 45 seconds, but to him, an eternity seemed to have passed. When the coast grew clear, Eric got out of the car, but he could barely walk after the shock he had lived through. He couldn't speak. It was one of the most horrifying and traumatic experiences of his life. According to the man, the real reason why he was so terrified was because he had no training, no warning, and no defense against whatever was coming. Later, he found out that the tornado had almost taken his life at a speed of 86 to 110 miles per hour and was around 75 to 100 yards across. A tornado is a rotating column of air that touches the ground. Sometimes it's connected to the base of a thunderstorm. The wind speeds inside tornadoes can top hundreds of miles an hour. No wonder they have enormously devastating potential, picking up objects, unrooting trees, destroying buildings, you name it. The problem with escaping a tornado is that it's not always easy to see. The wind, however severe it is invisible. The first sign of an approaching tornado might be the infamous rumble resembling the noise a moving freight train produces. There are also some other sounds indicating that a tornado is coming, but the human ear can't perceive those. When you spot that classic tornado cone, it means it has already developed a condensation funnel made of water, dust, and debris. The most destructive tornadoes are born from rotating thunderstorms, called supercells. Luckily, those are something meteorologists can actually notice because such storms have a well-defined appearance on radars. Experts believe that the difference in the temperature of such a storm can determine how likely a tornado is to form. And still, there's a lot we don't know about this process. For example, the question about why and where tornadoes are most likely to appear remains unanswered. The strength of tornadoes is measured with the enhanced Fujita scale. The rating goes from 0 to 5, considering the damage caused by a tornado and its wind speeds, where EF0 is the weakest tornado and EF5 is a tornado I hope you will never ever come across. The EF scale rounds off at wind speeds of 318 miles per hour, with strong frame houses being lifted off foundations and carried long distances to be eventually broken into pieces. Cars fly through the air for more than 328 feet away, and steel-reinforced structures are left badly damaged. Despite this terrifying power and ferocity of tornadoes, authorities report that even the worst of them have a 99% survival rate. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't take all possible precautions to avoid ending up inside one. Stay away from doors and windows. Move to an interior room if possible, and use pillows, blankets, and mattresses to protect yourself from flying debris. If stranded outside during a tornado, crawl into a ditch and cover yourself, protecting the head. Now, there's another twister that is as scary as a tornado, but this one forms in the water. Whirlpools appear when fast-flowing water crashes into an obstacle or another current. The water starts swirling in a downward spiral, creating a vortex that can pull objects, animals, and even small boats that happen to be nearby to the bottom. One more way for a whirlpool to form is the sudden appearance of a sinkhole created by a collapsed cave, for example. This makes water flood the hollow structure and creates a whirlpool similar to the one you see when you pull the plug out of a bath filled with water. While some whirlpools are small and brief, others can reach enormous sizes and be driven by constant currents. The most dangerous of them are maelstroms. If you get into a whirlpool like that, your chances to get back to the surface are slim. The incessant movement of the water and its pulling power can leave you disoriented and stuck without air. That's what happened to Stuart Foulstone when he got trapped in a whirlpool. His first instinct was to swim out of it, but this idea proved to be hopeless. The footage filmed by the cameraman attached to his helmet later showed that the man had been underwater for almost 3.5 minutes. He had probably been dragged all the way down to the riverbed. There, the pull of the twister lessened a bit and finally released its hold. The guy was lucky to get spotted face down in the water and pulled to the surface by a kayaker. The depth a whirlpool can pull you down to can vary. It depends on its power and size. Sadly, not everyone who got trapped in a whirlpool survived and got out again. In different ways in which whirlpools form means that sometimes they can appear out of the blue. You can't predict this process and get no warning. So the best way to stay safe is to wear your life jacket at all times when in the water. If you get pulled into a whirlpool, try not to move in the same direction as the water flow. Aim for the outer edge rather than the center of the twister. If you're lucky, the whirlpool might throw you back up. There have been precedents. And if you come over a whirlpool in a boat or kayak, do your best to stop the boat from filling with water.
The plane broke into 3 large pieces and crashed onto the hillside, scattering parts all over the snowy ground. The wings ripped off, and the main body of the aircraft split into 2 parts. Flames crackled from what was left of the airplane. 7 out of 9 crew members survived the crash. They were all part of the 1946 U.S. mission to map the Antarctic continent. There were 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 people to do the job. They only had 2 months of summer down there before the weather got too bad. USS Pine Island took 3 seaplanes on their mission. One of the planes, called George 1, had a crew of 9 people. They went on their first 10-hour mission. Later, when it was time for the second flight, the weather got worse, with stormy seas and low visibility. But they decided to take the chance and fly anyway. It was supposed to be an epic adventure, and even the captain of Pine Island joined the expedition. The pilot, Ralph Frenchy LeBlanc, was very experienced and not worried about the weather. The plane was tied to some small boats, but the waves were so strong that the lines holding it were damaging the plane's metal body. Crew members had to attach 4 special rocket boosters, called jet-assisted takeoff bottles, to help the plane lift off. It managed to do so after a run of about 5 miles, but got straight into a blinding snowstorm. James Robbie Robbins was just 19 years old back then, but already had 1,500 hours of experience as a radar operator in that type of seaplane. He once successfully flew 9 hours through thick fog and clouds in Greenland, so he trusted his abilities. The radar showed a mountain range 20 miles ahead and icebergs spread out, and it was all correct. They had to stay low to take photos for mapping, and it was impossible in bad weather. So the pilot decided to turn the plane around to head back to the ship. Suddenly, the plane hit something. At the time, they didn't know what it was, but later they realized it was a snow-covered ridge that was hidden and couldn't be seen on radar. The loud bang shocked everyone on board. The pilot and co-pilot quickly pushed the plane's controls to try to lift it back into the sky. But just a few seconds later, the fuel tank in the front of the plane blew up. Collapsing with a ridge likely cracked one of the fuel tanks, so the gas started to leak. The fumes from the gas might have been set on fire by an electrical spark or the plane's hot engines. The blast was so strong that it broke the plane into 3 parts. The pilot was hurt and stuck upside down in the burning front part of the aircraft. Some of the other men were also badly injured. Some crawled out of the wreckage, and others had been thrown out into the snow during the crash. Most of them couldn't even remember the bang or the impact. The crew managed to pull the trapped pilot out of the wreckage and put him into a sleeping bag inside the back part of the plane. They also tried to help Frederick Williams, who was severely injured. They placed him on a piece of debris to keep him still and wrapped him in blankets to keep him warm. Unfortunately, even though they did their best to take care of them, Williams passed away a few hours later. Sadly, the navigator and the radio man didn't survive the crash either. 3 crew members had only one blanket, so they took turns staying in the middle where it was warmer. For the first 3 days, the weather was really bad. It snowed a lot, and the sky was super dark and cloudy. The crew started looking through the wreckage for anything useful. Near what used to be the back part of the plane, they found 3 big boxes of pemmican. It's a kind of emergency food that has everything you need to stay healthy, but it's not the most delicious food on Earth. Each box had about 100 paper cups filled with this special food. They also found better food in the flight rations. There were steaks, potatoes, canned veggies, bread, butter, salt, pepper, sugar, canned milk, a few cookies, and even 2 big cans of peanut butter. They had enough food to last for a while, and they figured the pemmican would help them get through the long, dark winter if necessary. All of the fresh food was hidden in the snow, where the kitchen used to be, so they had to dig it out. They got most of the sugar by licking it off the snow and separating it by taste. The crew also found a small 2-burner stove in the emergency supplies, but they didn't have any fuel. Luckily, the plane had some fuel left in the tanks, so they tapped one of the lines and had enough to last a long time. They kept pots of snow to fill just 1 cup of water. After 3 days, the weather got better, the sky was clear, and the sun was shining brightly. From where they were, they could see the ocean down the hill. While exploring the wreckage, they found more sleeping bags, a camera with film, and other supplies like a sled and a life raft made for 9 people. Days went by, and the sun never went down. Huge, hungry seagulls hanging out right next to the wreck were getting on everyone's nerves. To distract themselves a bit, the crew played an old Navy game called Salvo. It's like a battleships game for 2 players, where your task is to find and defeat all the ships of your rival. They also took some photos of everyone and the wreck from different angles with a Brownie box camera they had on the plane. The radar man painted big yellow letters on the airplane's wings with the names of the deceased crew members to make sure rescuers knew what had happened. On the 13th day, a rescue plane finally showed up. Everyone shouted, waved, and did everything to get the pilot's attention, but the plane didn't stop and kept flying. 2 hours later, it came back, and Robbins, in a hurry, threw fuel onto a pile of flammable stuff to set it on fire. The bang was so big, it burned his eyebrows, but it worked. The plane turned and flew toward them, wiggling its wings as a sign it saw them. The pilot dropped a note attached to a weight. It said, "If you can walk to the lake, make a circle. If not, form a straight line." The lake was 10 miles away, but they knew they had no choice but to get there, and so they made a circle, signaling that they were ready for rescue. Then they got to work. They stacked sleeping bags on a sled and placed their injured pilot on top. Robbins took a compass from the crashed plane and attached it to the sled's handlebars to help guide them. 3 men pulled the sled while another walked behind, making sure they stayed on track. The snow was so deep that they often sank up to their waists. The journey only got easier when they reached solid ground, so it took them 24 hours to walk the 10 miles to the shore. As they got close, a thick fog rolled in, so they couldn't see the rescue plane. But the pilot started the engines, and the crew followed the sound. Soon, 2 rescuers arrived in a raft and helped them paddle out to the waiting plane. They climbed aboard and flew back to their ship, the Pine Island. All the survivors were taken to the USS Philippine Sea and later returned home. For 6 of the 9 men who crashed on Thurston Island, life continued. So get this, you're more likely to encounter a unicorn in a coffee shop than survive at the bottom of the ocean without air for more than half an hour. But some people are that lucky and unlucky at the same time. Take Chris Lemons, for example. Chris Lemons is a commercial saturation diver whose life changed in September 2012. It was a normal working day for him and his colleagues Duncan and David. They were sitting in a special chamber on the ship above the diving site. Then they entered a diving bell, crammed like sardines in a can. This is like another chamber dangling from the ship, which they use to get to the diving site. This chamber is like the claw machine you catch toys with, but instead of a claw, it has a small chamber at the end. They arrived at the diving site, and Chris and Dave prepared to dive. Duncan was staying in the bell to monitor the gear and, the most crucial part, the umbilical cord. This cord supplies divers with oxygen, heat, and power to keep their lights shining because at such a depth, it's super dark. So it's important for someone to monitor the situation since divers' lives depend on it. To better understand the process, you must know more about commercial saturation diving. Being in the office the whole day is much safer than being a commercial saturation diver, unless your office is in a lion's cage. Saturation diving is so rare and dangerous that you've probably just heard about it now. You must dive deep in the cold ocean to work on oil pipes and such. Diving in general can be risky because of something called decompression sickness. If you dive too deep and rise to the surface too quickly, tiny bubbles of nitrogen can form inside your body, which can cause serious health issues or worse. That is not a problem for regular divers because they don't dive nearly as deep as saturation divers. Saturation divers go from 600 feet to 1,000 feet underwater. That's almost the height of the Empire State Building. Rising to the surface from that crazy depth can take as long as 2 weeks. It takes less time to go to the moon and back. It's almost impossible to stay in the water for 2 weeks, so divers have a unique trick that keeps them alive. A chamber cleverly designed to have the same pressure as the bottom of the ocean. They spend months in this chamber. The chamber is isolated. It's like being in jail, but much worse. You can't get out no matter what. The world could be on fire, but you'd have to stay inside or pass away. The good news is that divers have the internet there. The chamber is filled with a mixture of helium and oxygen, so if you want to call your family, you will sound funny. Most divers don't call anybody.
Because it's fun to inhale helium and talk in a funny voice for a short time.
But doing it for weeks isn't very pleasant. Now you know more about this type of job and how dangerous it is. Thanks to all those clever tricks, divers can do their job without facing significant risks. But sometimes, bad things are inevitable. So let's return to our story. Chris and Dave had to replace a pipe section and do regular checkups at the bottom of the North Sea. For them, it was like teaching a cat to nap, whatever that is. But the weather above them was not so good. There was a strong wind and waves that reached 13 feet. On the other hand, weather like that was typical for the North Sea, so there was nothing unusual to worry about. The ship carrying out the mission had a crazy feature similar to autopilot. No matter how many waves there were, it would keep the vessel stable. The dive was going smoothly until the alarm started beeping out of nowhere. Dave and Chris immediately climbed in. David made it to the bell safely, but Chris's cord caught the edge of the manifold, and no matter what he did, he couldn't get out. He thought this should not have happened because there was plenty of slackline. He could hear the cord tightening, then realized that the ship had started moving. He had basically become an anchor, and as we all know, humans are not designed to be anchors. The cord snapped, and he fell to the bottom of the sea. This was the worst situation that could happen to him. He lost everything: oxygen, communication, and heat, meaning he would either freeze or suffocate. He had around 5 minutes of emergency O2, but that was not nearly enough to survive. Chris had to climb up to the manifold to be rescued, but when the cord snapped, his light went out, so he had to walk in the pitch-black sea and navigate by feeling around. Chris couldn't even see his hands, but he did the impossible and climbed to the manifold. The problems didn't end there, unfortunately. He was in the worst possible situation, and no one could tell him what to do or what had happened. Every breath was more valuable than a bucket of gold, so he had to breathe super slowly. Chris had only 2 minutes of oxygen left by the time he climbed up, And after some time, when he didn't see any signs of the rescue team, he lost all hope. The ship that was supposed to save him was in chaos. They couldn't stay stable to find him. All odds were against Chris at that moment. The only thing in his favor was that the ship had a small submarine that could be controlled remotely, and the crew could see what had happened to him. They got to the diving spot, and it was like watching a horror movie. You can't look away, and you can't unsee it. They all expected to see the diver in the worst possible shape. By some miracle, he was still moving, but not for long. Hundreds of people were glued to the screen, watching their colleagues suffer. They weren't that far from the site, but they couldn't do anything to save their friend. After the ship had stabilized, they went where Chris was. By that time, they had lost all hope and were going down to recover the body. David was tasked with getting Chris. He was feeling on edge, but prepared mentally for the challenge ahead. Around a half hour later, David finally arrived at the destination. He immediately grabbed Chris and climbed into the bell. Duncan was waiting for them inside. When they arrived, Duncan immediately took off Chris's diving mask. What they saw was horrifying. Chris's face was not the usual color, and he was cold. He looked like he had passed away. Duncan had tried giving him first aid, and suddenly, Chris jumped up, lively as can be, and sat down in his seat. David and Duncan were shocked. Chris seemed to be completely fine. He was examined by lots of doctors and was announced to be as healthy as someone who had spent a half an hour without air could be. By all odds, he shouldn't have survived more than 3 minutes without air. No scientist to this day knows how he survived. It could have been because he had been exposed to a high level of O2 in the chamber, and he also had a higher than normal O2 level in his lungs. The cold temperature could have slowed down his metabolism and prevented him from losing too much energy, but nobody knows for sure. Now, you would think that after this, he would never dive again, but he continues to work as a saturation diver to this day and has no intention of quitting. He even got back to the same spot that nearly destroyed him and finished the job that he had started. Wow.
A human being can survive up to a couple of months without food, a few days without water, and 69 days trapped underground. At least, that's what 33 miners in Chile managed to do. The 5th of August, 2010, started like a regular workday deep underground. The miners were going about their business, digging for copper, gold, and other minerals. Some of them were working almost 2,500 feet below the surface. Another group was resting in the refuge, a room carved out of the rock for miners to relax in and breathe some fresh air pumped in from the surface. They were waiting for a pickup truck to give them a ride up for lunch. Around 2 p.m., they felt some massive vibrations. A massive bang followed. Everything around started shaking. Dust filled the air, and the passageway collapsed, trapping the men inside. When the noise faded, the miners decided to make a run up to the surface from the refuge. Their shift manager and others joined forces, determined to rescue every single man. Deep below, 2 miners were loading rocks into a truck when they felt a burst of pressure. They thought it was nothing extraordinary until the dust became so thick that they couldn't see a thing. Driving blindly, they almost collided with their shift supervisor, who signaled them to stop. With the truck now packed with terrified men, they set on a treacherous journey toward the surface. The truck struggled under the weight of its passengers, but it pressed on. They met up with more workers, cramming onto the truck like sardines. Obstacle by obstacle, they moved to the surface until they bumped into a huge rock, weighing around 700,000 tons and as tall as a 45-story building. They sent the smallest of the miners to see if there was any hope of squeezing through next to the rock. He only managed to crawl 10 feet forward with a lamp in his hand and told everyone else there was no chance to get any further. Some of the older miners got trapped at work before, but it would usually be some rocks that a bulldozer could clear in a couple of hours. This time, it was different. The miners didn't plan to give up, so they split. and one group searched for shafts that let air, water, and electricity flow into the mine. Those are supposed to have ladders to serve as an escape room. They managed to find one chimney with a ladder. One of the miners climbed up, breathing in dust and holding onto slippery walls. The chimney led him to the same rocky wall they'd seen before. It meant only one thing. There really was no way out. They had to deliver the sad news to the rest of the miners who went back to the refuge. It had enough snacks to feed 33 people for several days. Someone grabbed the snacks, still not realizing they could be stuck down there for days or weeks. Cans of peaches, peas, and tuna, 6 gallons of condensed milk, and 93 packages of cookies were all they had. The one thing they wouldn't have to worry about was water. There was more than enough of it in nearby tanks, which were keeping the engines cool. All the connections to the outside world, the electricity, the intercom system, the flow of water, and compressed air have been cut. Men working above the ground on that fateful day also heard the blasts and saw the dust cloud in front of the main entrance. While the miners were settling in for the first night in the refuge, the local emergency squad was trying to do everything in their power to save everyone. One team went down in a pickup truck until they bumped into the gray rock mass at around 1,500 feet. Another team tried descending on ropes and pulleys into the chimneys, but they found obstructions at each level. The supervisor of the team took off his distinctive white helmet to show all the workers were equal now. As the miners remembered later, it was one inspiring gesture for them. On the 7th of August, there was another collapse that blocked the ventilation shafts. On the next day, the rescuers started drilling holes and sent down listening probes to see if there were any signs of life down there, with no results. The maps of the mine were outdated, which made the search more complicated. Deep below the surface, the miners tried to keep their spirits up, talking, joking, and telling stories. Their phones didn't have a signal, but they could still use them as cameras to record videos about their survival underground. Their metabolisms were slowing down, and even the most active among them were sleeping longer than usual and having scary nightmares. There was a haze drifting over their thoughts. They spent 17 days without any contact with the outside world, eating only once every other day. Some of the miners started having health problems. On the 22nd of August, one of around 30 probes sent into the mine detected tapping. It came back with a note saying, "All 33 of us are all right in the shelter." Soon, rescuers managed to deliver food, water, letters, first aid, and other necessary supplies through the narrow borehole. They also sent down high-tech video cameras that beamed back live footage of the men in their steamy, sauna-like surroundings. The miners invented a system of jobs and routines to survive in those conditions and remain sane. Above ground, an international team of engineering and mining geniuses put their heads together to crack the code of how to bring those brave souls back up to the surface. They came up with a plan to drill an escape tunnel and lower a capsule inside the mine, large enough to fit one person at a time. Then a crane would pull the capsule back to the surface. They brought 3 separate drilling rigs to the site and began work on the 30th of August, 25 days after the accident. The trapped workers were helping their rescue from below. They formed 3 teams and worked 8-hour shifts, demolishing debris caused by the drilling to reinforce the mine's walls. The original plan was to set them free by December, but Plan B drill finished working on a tunnel by the 9th of October. It took 2 more days to line up the tunnel with metal tubing. Finally, a rescue worker went down into the mine inside the capsule. The families and friends of the miners were waiting above the ground in a makeshift Camp Hope. The first worker got out of the mine after a 15-minute journey through 2,050 feet of rock inside the capsule. He was greeted as a hero. One by one, they all escaped from the refuge. Millions of people around the globe followed the rescue on live TV. It took less than a day instead of the planned 48 hours. All 33 of the miners, aged 19 to 63, had been rescued and were mostly in good health. They all had to wear dark glasses to help their eyes to the sun after being in a space with so little light for so long. One of the last miners to have climbed back up on the surface was Franklin Lobos, a former professional soccer player. While he was down there, teams around the world signed jerseys for him. Franklin got that welcome gift and a soccer ball. He said it had been the toughest match of his entire life. The incredible 33 were showered with love and praise. They were guaranteed 6 months of top-notch health care. They traveled to international destinations to talk as motivational speakers, appear in public, and explore famous landmarks. There was even a parade at Florida's Walt Disney World in the miners' honor. A movie named 33, based on their story, came out in 2015, featuring Antonio Banderas. He played the role of the miner who filmed daily video logs to assure the public that they were all right. This story, which many find to be a real miracle, went down in history and in the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest time survived trapped underground. A story that will surely send chills down your spine is about a daring young American sailor named Tammy Oldham Ashcraft. Back in 1983, when she was just 23 years old, she had quite the adventure. Along with her British beau Richard Sharp, she was tasked with navigating the ocean from Tahiti to San Diego in California on a luxury yacht. But you know how the ocean can be. It's not always smooth sailing. 20 days into the journey, the two lovebirds got ensnared in a Category 4 hurricane, coming with monstrous waves and wicked winds. Even though they stood their ground against the raging waves, the yacht was rolled over like a beach ball as it tumbled between two waves. The last thing etched in Tammy's memory, before being knocked out cold for 27 hours, is Richard shouting as an enormous wave slammed onto their boat. Later on, she penned down her harrowing ordeal in a book, which was later turned into a movie. Tammy had her fair share of sailing experience under her belt before the fateful journey. She had great navigation skills and had already sailed across the Pacific twice. Setting off from Tahiti to San Diego, they initially had a decent journey, but a couple of weeks in, trouble started brewing. They caught wind of a tropical area down by Panama, and before they knew it, the storm was charging west and gathering intensity. The pair made efforts to reach the safety zone, but the hurricane was moving at incredible speed. As fate would have it, the usually short-lived hurricane kept going. Facing giant waves and hurricane winds is enough to give anyone nightmares. The boat took a hammering, and despite their best preparations, dealing with such rough seas was a monumental task. The boat would leap into the air over the towering waves and come crashing down, making the whole structure shudder. Richard was in the cockpit, secured with a safety harness as they bobbed over the massive waves. But then, they ran into rogue waves. Those monstrous anomalies that come out of nowhere. One such wave made the boat do a 360-degree flip, and that was the last thing Tammy remembered. When she came to her senses, Richard was nowhere to be found. The safety harnesses meant to keep him attached to the boat were ruptured. With no one nearby to pick up her distress signals, Tammy was left with a non-functioning long-distance radio after 2 weeks of relentless battering from the sea. All she had was a short-range, very high-frequency VHF radio, which gave up after 5 days due to water damage. She was alone and completely cut off. Tammy had to rely on her basic tools to navigate to Hawaii, a sextant and sight reduction tables. Using the sun's position, she determined her latitude, and once she found her watch, she could also figure out her longitude. It took a while, but she did make it to Hawaii. Throughout her time being lost at sea, Tammy showed just how resourceful she was. She remembered trying to get the engine running, but some of the boat's parts had melted onto the propeller shaft. Despite being mechanically inclined, she couldn't waste time trying to fix something that was potentially beyond repair. Instead, she relied on her training as a bosun. Tammy also kept a log of her time at sea, always aware that if she didn't make it, this might be the only clue to what happened. Looking back on the log, she admitted that her mental state had been fragile during her ordeal. Despite everything, Tammy shared that the human survival instinct is incredibly strong. She wanted to live. The hero of our next tale is a man named Steve Callahan. His story, though it sounds like a Hollywood movie script, is real as real can be. Back in 1982, Steve found himself participating in a single-handed sailing race across the vast Atlantic Ocean. He trusted his voyage to a self-designed vehicle, proudly named Napoleon Solo. It was a sturdy, reliable boat built to weather storms and defy waves. But unpredictable weather loomed in, tearing into the race fleet and sinking a bunch of boats. Steve had to sideline himself and dock his beloved Napoleon Solo in Spain for some urgent repairs. After patching up the boat, Steve took off again, this time setting his sights on the Canary Islands. His heart was set on crossing the Atlantic and reaching the sandy shores of Antigua. Sadly, his boat was battered by strong winds, leaving it significantly damaged. Steve found himself with no choice but to abandon the ship. He soon boarded an inflatable life raft. Steve decided he wasn't going down without a fight. Before Napoleon Solo sank into the depths of the Atlantic, he dived repeatedly into the turbulent waters to salvage what he could. With a few essential items secured, he battled hunger, thirst, and loneliness for the next 76. Some fishermen eventually found him and whisked him off to a local hospital where he began his recovery. Now you might think this is where Steve's story ends. His incredible saga of survival was shared far and wide in sailing magazines, featured on numerous TV shows, and finally cemented in his own book. But the record for the longest time ever spent lost at sea was broken by a man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga. He is an incredibly tough soul whose tenacity and will to survive would become the stuff of legends. That's because for 438 long, difficult days, he was adrift. A fisherman by trade, Jose was no stranger to the sea's unpredictable moods. His life's most terrifying adventure started on a day just like any other, in 2012. That was the day Jose and his fishing mate headed off the shores of a quaint fishing village named Costa Azul in Mexico. It was their first voyage together. Life, however, had a nasty surprise in store for them. Soon after they had left the comfort of the shoreline behind, they were ambushed by a furious storm. It tossed their small boat about like a toy, steering it off its course. Their ship's motor and most of their onboard electronics were rendered useless. Jose, displaying his quick thinking, managed to radio his boss for help before the communication device gave up, but the response was as powerless as their situation. For 5 relentless days, the storm messed with them. When the skies finally cleared, Jose and his mate found themselves lost, with no idea of their whereabouts or how to get back. To make matters worse, the storm had taken away most of their fishing equipment, leaving them with mere basic survival tools. Their boat no longer had sails, motors, or oars. Month after month, they drifted aimlessly. Their sustenance came from good old Mother Nature, rainwater, and a random collection of sea critters like fish, turtles, and birds. After about 4 months, Jose lost his friend, but he decided to carry on, in hopes he'd one day be rescued. Little did he know, he was nowhere near the end of his journey. He attempted signaling every passing ship he saw, but his desperate cries for help were useless. Relying solely on rainwater and whatever the sea offered him for food, Jose kept track of his days by the changing phases of the moon. It was a bit over a year after the disastrous storm that Jose finally sighted land. His heart filled with hope, and he abandoned his trusty but worn-out boat, choosing to swim towards the shore. To his amazement, he found himself on one of the Marshall Islands, situated on the far side of the Pacific from where his ordeal had begun. The man was taken to a hospital where he slowly but steadily recovered his strength. Upon his return, his family declared they had never given up on him and were over the moon on the news of his discovery. However, this survival story was so fantastical that many raised their eyebrows in doubt. Could a man really survive for so long at sea on a tiny boat? However, there were those who offered a counterpoint. Experts explained that fresh meat from birds and turtles, which Alvarenga claimed to have consumed in plenty, contained enough vitamin C to ensure survival.
We've heard so much information about this terrible tragedy that happened on the night of April 14, 1912. What really caused the disaster? Could the Titanic passengers have been saved? Was the ship cursed? All these questions still remain unanswered. So this time, let's not focus on the tragic side of the event, but on the fantastic stories of people who miraculously managed to survive that day and what happened to them in the future. As you know, when Titanic crashed into the iceberg, the ship's crew first evacuated the women and children. But among the passengers, one woman remained on the sunken vessel and survived after it went underwater. Her name was Rhoda Abbott. She and her 2 sons lived in England and had been living there for 2 years before they decided to return home to Providence, Rhode Island. Rhoda bought 3 third-class tickets for the most modern and unsinkable ship of that time. The whole family slept in their cabin on that ominous night from April 14th to 15th. They didn't feel the jolt and got up only after the steward knocked on the door. He asked them to wear life jackets and go to the upper deck. Then, along with other third-class passengers, they waited in line to board the lifeboats. The crew members allowed only women and little kids to go further. Still, the brothers negotiated with the team and walked their mother to the lifeboat. All 3 went to the last lifeboat, but the crew asked the sons to leave since not all the women had been evacuated. Rhoda didn't want to leave her sons, so she decided to stay with them. She left the boat and hugged the boys. By this time, the ship was sinking into a stern-up position. The deck tilted. Rhoda tried to hold her sons but couldn't. She slapped off the deck and fell into the icy water. From there, she swam to the lifeboat that was washed away from the deck. Rhoda climbed aboard and watched the Titanic go under the water. Unfortunately, she was unable to save her 2 sons. Besides her, there were 13 people in the boat. But in the end, no one except Rhoda survived. A few hours later, the ship Carpathia arrived and found a nearly frozen Rhoda in the boat. The vessel arrived almost 3 days later in New York, where Rhoda was hospitalized, and she lay there for about 2 weeks. Swimming in cold water caused her asthma, which remained with her for life. Later, she admitted that she hadn't regretted that she had refused to evacuate with other women because she got a little extra time to spend with her sons that night. Another survivor of Titanic was Violet Jessup. She boarded the ship not as a passenger, but as a working staff. She was hired by the White Star Line, which was looking for people to serve wealthy clients on the new luxury liner. And on April 10th, after an interview, Violet boarded the Titanic. The first days of work went as usual, but then the ship crashed into an iceberg. In the beginning, no one panicked and didn't even want to believe that the unsinkable boat could go down. But while the people on the upper deck were having these conversations, water flooded the ship's hold. Violet, along with other stewards, helped people evacuate. One of the ship's commanders ordered Violet to get into the boat first to show everyone else it was safe. She obeyed and spent several hours there until rescuers came for the survivors. But the most exciting thing in this story was that before the Titanic, Violet had already been in another shipwreck. The ship where she worked as a steward collided with another vessel at sea. All the people were saved, and Violet got a job on the Titanic a few years later. But even after the famous shipwreck, she didn't change her profession and went to the Britannic Floating Hospital. And you know what? It also sank. Violet managed to survive for the 3rd time, but this didn't scare the girl. After all these events, she continued her work on other ships. She survived 3 shipwrecks and got a name for this: Miss Unsinkable. One of the bravest passengers of the Titanic was the ship's chief baker, Charles Jogan. On the night of April 14th, he woke up after the collision with the iceberg. During the few hours as the ship was sinking underwater, Charles helped the passengers. First, he ordered his bakers to supply all rescue boats with food, then helped the crew evacuate the passengers. He was one of the last people left on the ship when all rescue boats were on the water. But still, he continued to save people's lives. Charles started to throw deck chairs overboard so people could hold on to them. Then, when half of the Titanic went down, he lowered into the icy water, where he noticed a capsized rescue boat. Charles boarded it and waited a few hours until rescuers appeared. And the most incredible thing is that he was completely fine when the Carpathia arrived and found him. He had not even a scratch and wasn't at all hypothermic. Among the Titanic's surviving passengers was Margaret Brown, known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown. She was visiting a friend in England with her daughter. But when Margaret found out her grandson was ill, she immediately bought a ticket to New York on board the Titanic. After colliding with the iceberg, Margaret bravely helped people evacuate until the stewards forced her to get into a boat. She continued to help other passengers until they were rescued by the Carpathia. Margaret created a survivors committee and raised about $10,000. At that time, it was quite a lot of money. For many years, she protected and supported the Titanic's passengers, who were in poor financial condition. Margaret also helped to build the Titanic Memorial in Washington. A wealthy English businessman, J. Bruce Ismay, was on board the Titanic, and the shipwreck was not the only disaster for him. He managed to jump into the last boat 20 minutes before Titanic was completely submerged. Thus, he saved his life but condemned himself to eternal contempt. When he was on the mainland, the newspapers began to write about him as the main coward of the Titanic. Also, some articles accused him of sinking the ship. Ismay was a White Star Line company director that created the ship, and according to newspaper articles, the businessman asked the captain to sail faster. He wanted the ship to arrive in America ahead of schedule and receive good reviews in the press. As a result, the ship crashed into the iceberg at high speed and damaged the hull. Nobody proved the businessman's guilt. Almost all of the criticism of Bruce Ismay was concentrated in one newspaper. Its publisher had a fight with the businessman before the tragedy, so they decided to destroy his reputation. Britain organized an independent investigation, which concluded that Ismay did nothing wrong. Yeah, he jumped into the last boat, but only after all the women and children were evacuated. However, the investigation didn't help to clear his reputation. In England and America, many friends and colleagues turned away from him. For many years, Ismay compensated the families who lost someone on the Titanic. The most famous passengers of the Titanic were an orchestra of 8 musicians. In the beginning, there was no panic when the ship collided with the iceberg. Many refused to get into the boats, as it seemed to them that it was safer on the Titanic. Others were sure the breakdown on the ship would soon be repaired. Some people didn't believe the ship could sink. A minor panic began when everyone realized a catastrophe was imminent. To calm the people down a bit, the 8 musicians from 2 ensembles started playing music. Survivors said the orchestra played until the very end. Fear for their lives and the nearness of the end didn't confuse the valiant men. Unfortunately, they didn't survive, but a memory about them was written in history forever, and their musical instruments became world-famous artifacts and very valuable items at auctions. There are very snowy winters in Sweden, you know. Snow covers all roads and slows down the traffic. Some cars may pull over to the side of the road and get out only with the help of a tractor. This is a common thing. But one day, during a snowfall, something astonishing happened. On December 19, 2011, a man named Peter Skylberg found himself in a snow trap after he drove off the main road in the north of Sweden. Then snowmobilers accidentally found him, pulled him out of there, and took him to the hospital. It may seem like something common, but here's the kicker. It took 2 months to find him, and outside of that time, the temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. That man survived after spending 60 days without water, food, and heat sources among icy winds and endless snow. The people who found him said the car was buried deep in snow at 3 feet. And Peter Skylberg was sitting shaking inside a sleeping bag in the front seat. He couldn't speak. When they brought him to the hospital, the doctors were amazed. They knew cases when people survived in cold temperatures for a long time, but not for 2 months. A person can live without water for several days, but Peter had no problems with this since he extracted water from the snow. Without food, a person can survive for several weeks to 3 months. But what about the cold? How did Peter solve this problem? At such low temperatures, people can freeze within several hours. The doctors treating Peter claimed that his body seemed to activate survival mode and fell into a deep sleep. It's like bears that hibernate during winter. But the human body can only lower the temperature by a few degrees. This is not enough to survive in minus 22-degree frost. Maybe the man somehow managed to lower the temperature even more. The case of Peter Skylberg became famous. Doctors and scientists from all over the world put forward their hypotheses about how this man managed to survive. No one could give the exact reason. Many people claimed it was just a real miracle. Others believed it was the result of several factors combined together. One of these factors is the sleeping bag. It helps keep your body heat better, so your temperature may not drop for a long time inside the bag. Another factor that probably played the key role was the igloo effect. Indigenous peoples living at the North Pole make their homes out of ice and snow. You've probably seen these round houses on the internet or in the movies. It's not warm inside them, but it doesn't let the cold in. The particular design of these houses helps keep the accumulated heat inside. Igloos can protect from strong winds, but it's possible to survive inside them only if you're wearing warm clothes. Perhaps Peter's car turned into such a house. Snow clung to it from all sides and blocked the heat inside. Many people wondered why he hadn't tried to get out and find help. But seems like Peter did the right thing. It's pretty dangerous to go out in such conditions. You don't know where you are, it's freezing cold, and there's a blizzard. Let's say you get out of the car and try to get to the nearest road. You fail and come back. But you can't find your car because the snow has covered it. Now your situation is even worse. The only option is to start digging snow and make an igloo. If you have warm clothes, an igloo will help you to keep warm and gain some time. But the right solution is to stay inside the car and wait for the rescuers, especially if you don't know where you are. If you don't have communication or signal lights, then try to make a fire. Smoke can attract the attention of people passing on the nearest road. Peter Skylberg spent some time in the hospital, regained strength, and was cured. Now, it's much safer to be in a closed cold room or an igloo during the cold. However, if you're stuck in a severe frost without warm clothes, you have about 30 minutes to 2 hours, maybe even less if you don't move. But in 1980, a miracle happened that shocked people and doctors all over the U.S. 19-year-old Jean Hillyard was driving home at night to the small town of Lengby. She lost control and ended up in a ditch. The girl decided to walk to her friend. She then saw her friend's house, but she didn't get there. She got too weak and fainted. Suddenly, Jean fell and lost consciousness near her friend's house. Jean Hillyard was wearing a light winter coat, cowboy boots, and pants, so she wasn't quite prepared for harsh winter conditions. There was a strong blizzard and snowfall outside, so no one noticed her. The friend Jean wanted to visit only saw the frozen girl near his porch in the morning. Jean Hillyard had been lying there for 6 hours. Her body was hard and cold, as if it were made of rubber. Her eyes looked as if they were made of glass. The man who noticed the girl was sure she wasn't alive. But then, he saw bubbles of moisture from her nose. The girl was breathing. He got the girl to the hospital. Her body wouldn't bend, so putting the girl in the car was problematic. The doctors immediately rushed to help Jean, but that wasn't easy. They couldn't even make any injections, as the needles would constantly break. The muscles were too stiff and frozen. Her body activated emergency mode and stopped supplying muscles and soft tissues with blood. All the red liquid was directed at the vital organs. Also, in emergency mode, our organism can slow down all internal processes of the body. The heart starts pounding slower, the lungs consume less oxygen, and the metabolism nearly stops. Such energy savings helped the girl to survive. But the doctors were more surprised that Jean didn't get any serious troubles. She got frostbite, but the ice crystals didn't destroy her skin and soft tissues. Doctors decided to warm the girl with a bunch of heating pads. Then they finally managed to inject medications. A few hours later, she regained consciousness. The test showed that Jean was in perfect health. Meanwhile, you can get into a severe trap not only in nature and bad weather. You can get stuck in an elevator in a building full of people in Manhattan, and no one will know about it. This happened in 1999 with Nicholas White. The 34-year-old manager was working late in the office and decided to take a break. After getting some fresh air outside, Nicholas called the elevator to go back to the 43rd floor. But he got trapped in the elevator. It was already quite late, and almost all the workers had left the building. But the worst thing was that it was Friday night. Nicholas had no phone, no food, and no water. He pressed the emergency call button, but no one answered him. The cameras worked perfectly, but the guards didn't see him. The building was basically empty. Nicholas struggled with claustrophobia, walked from side to side, jumped, laid down, tried to open the doors, and waited for someone to rescue him. There were repair workers on the other floors, but they didn't hear Nicholas. Also, his colleagues stayed in the office where he worked. They were sure that Nicholas had just gone home. They left the office using other elevators and didn't notice that Nicholas had left his things on his desk. Well, Nicholas was in despair. He was rescued 41 hours later. He was lying on the elevator floor, tormented by thirst, when he suddenly heard a voice from the elevator speaker. "Hey, is anyone there?" Rescuers got the man out of the metal box, and the building owners paid him compensation for the inconvenience. Despite this nightmare, Nicholas continued to use the elevators. Yeah, living in Manhattan, it would be problematic to avoid them. Certainly for Nicholas, life has its ups and downs. Hey, want to hear something shocking? In an ordinary house outlet that we use to charge the phone, the voltage is 110 volts. A high-voltage power line that provides electricity to dozens of buildings has a voltage of 100,000 volts. The energy of one lightning strike is more than 10 million volts. Woo! And the temperature of lightning is almost twice the temperature on the sun's surface. And this incredible charge is flying at a speed of just 2.5 times slower than the speed of light. Now imagine what happens to a person when lightning strikes them. Well, let me tell you, the discharge passes through the body in 1/100th of a second. Lightning can stop our hearts and disrupt the work of our entire nervous system. You may not even realize what has happened at first. Perhaps you will lose consciousness and your body will be in a state of shock. Every day, there are several million lightning strikes in the world. Fortunately, you have little chance of getting hit by one. The odds that lightning will strike you is about 15,300 to 1. About 20,000 people are struck by lightning every year. The chances that lightning will strike you twice are even smaller. And what are the odds that you'll be struck by lightning 7 times throughout your life? It seems impossible, but one person experienced it for himself. His name was Roy Sullivan. He was born in 1912 in Greene County, Virginia, in a big family with 7 children. Roy was an ordinary guy and was no different from his brothers and sisters. But for some reason, the natural element chose him. In 1936, he began working as a ranger at Shenandoah National Park. There, lightning struck him 7 times over 35 years. So, the first accident happened in April 1942. On that day, a strong thunderstorm began. Roy took refuge in a new fire tower where builders hadn't installed a lightning rod. Lightning struck the building several times. A massive fire started inside and Roy ran out. As soon as he was a few feet away from the shelter, lightning hit his toe and burned a hole in his shoe. The next time occurred 27 years later, in July 1969. Roy was working in the national park. He was driving a truck through hilly terrain when a storm started. Lightning struck him through the open car window. The charge burned his eyebrows and eyelashes and slightly touched his hair. Roy lost consciousness and the car continued to move. It stopped at the very edge of a cliff. 15 minutes later, Roy came to his senses. A year later, in July 1970, the third time occurred. The weather was fine, but in a matter of minutes, clouds became thicker and a thunderstorm began. Lightning struck a transformer near Roy. The man ran away as fast as possible, but nature got him again. Lightning hit his shoulder. 2 years later, in 1972, lightning struck Roy for the 4th time while he was working at the National Park Station. The charge set his hair on fire, and the man ran to the bathroom and used a wet towel to put out the flames on his burning head. From that moment, Roy began to suspect that some invisible evil force had been pursuing him. He started to carry a bottle of water with him to put out the fire in case of another hit. The fifth strike happened in the national park again. It occurred in 1973. Roy tripped over a rock and fell. At that moment, he noticed thunderclouds in the sky. Frightened, he ran to his truck, got inside, and stepped on the gas. Roy drove as far from that spot as possible. Then he stopped and got out of the car to see where the storm was. And at that moment, lightning struck again. It went through his left arm and left leg and set his shoe on fire. Roy quickly climbed back into the truck and extinguished the fire using his water bottle. In 1976, the sixth case occurred. Roy was walking along a trail in the park, just 1 mile away from the place where lightning struck him the last time. And then storm clouds appeared again. Lightning flashed and stung Roy in the palm. After the sixth strike, he began to suspect something was wrong with the park. After 40 years of working, Roy finally decided to quit. Finally. He hoped the lightning would stop chasing him, but he was wrong. By that time, the man had already become a celebrity. But such fame didn't let him enjoy life. People were afraid to be near him because they believed the lightning could hit them at any moment. Journalists gave Roy Sullivan the nicknames Spark Ranger and Human Lightning Conductor. Of course, the man disliked all of this and felt very lonely. But besides this problem, he also suffered from constant fears and the feeling of persecution. All the time, he was waiting for the lightning to strike again at any moment. Fortunately, he was married. His wife supported him and helped him in everything. After quitting his job, Roy decided to move with his wife to the small town of Dooms, Virginia. Wow, Dooms. Talk about foreshadowing. It was only a year without accidents. Then, on June 25, 1977, lightning struck Roy again. He went fishing at the local pond early in the morning. The catch was good, but the sky was overcast. Roy immediately felt there would be a strike. There was a smell of sulfur in the air, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. His whole body tensed. Lightning struck Roy in the head, passing through his chest and stomach. The man ran to his car to take cover. At that moment, a hungry bear came out of the forest. He approached Roy's bucket of fish to pick up all the trout the man had caught. Roy ran out of the vehicle with his hair on his head smoldering to chase the animal away. After the seventh lightning strike, he lost hearing in his left ear and realized he couldn't hide from the lightning anywhere. His wife was afraid to be with him outside during a thunderstorm. One day, she was hanging laundry in the backyard. Roy came out of the house to help her. A few minutes later, lightning struck his wife. Fortunately, she wasn't badly injured. After that, besides fear and social loneliness, he felt guilt. Of course, many doctors and scientists tried to help Roy, but no one managed to find the reason for this strange phenomenon. According to science, each time it was just a coincidence. Mathematics and physics were powerless here. With such answers from scientists, Roy believed that invisible forces were pursuing him or that fate was punishing him for something. Perhaps the answer lies in the man's past. The National Park Service and doctors documented all 7 times when he was struck by lightning. But there was another 8th time, which couldn't be confirmed. According to Roy, lightning struck him in his youth when he was helping his father mow wheat. The discharge hit the scythe blade. No one but the boy saw it. Perhaps at that moment, the lightning changed something in his body and made him more attractive for the next hits. Lightning always chooses the path of least resistance. And this is how lightning occurs. Rain, ice, and snow particles collide with one another inside a storm. This process increases the imbalance between clouds and the ground, negatively charging the lower layers of clouds. Things down there, like trees and the earth, get positively charged and create another imbalance. Nature tries to remedy this imbalance between the two opposite charges by passing an electric current through them. Perhaps nature felt some charge imbalance in Roy's body and tried to remedy it. But why did he get struck at an interval of 1 to 2 years? Besides, more than 20 years passed between the first and second hit. Scientists still can't explain what happened to him. Maybe Roy was just an attractive guy. As you can probably predict, Roy Sullivan was listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the person struck by lightning most often in the world. It's winter 1980. We're in the small town of Lyngby. 19-year-old Jean Hillyard is driving home after meeting with a friend. She takes a shortcut and turns into an icy, slippery road. In the dark, she loses control of the rear-wheel drive car. The vehicle crashes into a ditch. Emergency lights, snowfall, night, and a hard frost. Jean gets out of the vehicle. She's wearing only a light winter coat, mittens, and cowboy boots. The air temperature is much lower than in a freezer. Jean is sure that her friend lives nearby, so she goes that way. She climbs a high hill and realizes she's taken the wrong route. It seems she's gotten lost. The girl wanders a couple more miles and notices her other friend's house in the distance. Freezing, she walks there. Then everything turns black. Jean loses consciousness. The next morning, rancher Wally Nelson wakes up in a great mood. It's the holiday season. There's a winter fairy tale outside the window. He leaves his house and notices the body of Jean Hillyard lying just a few feet from his porch. Wally approaches the girl, shakes her, and is horrified. Her body is stiff and cold like frozen wood. Her eyes are open and don't move. Her hair is frozen. She just doesn't look alive. But Wally sees that she's still breathing. Jean has managed to survive. Wally wants to put her in his car to bring her to the doctor, but the girl's body doesn't bend and can't fit into the auto. It feels like a statue. He takes a bigger car and rushes to the hospital as fast as possible. The doctors take Jean, but they don't think she has any chance to make it. Her hand is so hard and frozen that no needle can penetrate it. A low temperature, glassy eyes, and muscles as hard as stone are all the results of emergency mode. Her body has directed all the blood to the vital organs to ensure their functioning. That's why other parts of her body look so lifeless, and her skin and muscles don't react to anything. The doctors decide to put heating pads on the girl to warm her up. Her family hopes for her recovery, but right now, all they can do is just wait. Frostbite is so dangerous because all that frozen liquid begins to expand. Fill a small bottle with water and put it in the freezer for a few hours. Then take it out, and you'll see that the bottle seems to have expanded or even cracked because of the increased volume of the liquid. The same thing happens inside our bodies. We consist of almost 70% water. When it freezes, its particles turn into ice crystals and tear cell membranes. Ice fragments can stretch and destroy tissue. This is called frostbite. Also, our body can slow down all internal processes in extreme cold conditions to save strength and energy. The heart makes fewer beats, and the lungs stop consuming lots of oxygen. Metabolism slows down. It happened with Jean, and perhaps it is what saved her life that day. She was lying in the snow in severe frost for about 6 hours. But why didn't the ice particles start destroying her cell membranes? How did her body withstand such damage and manage to survive? Back at the hospital, doctors are happy to watch Jean get better. Warm blood spreads through the frozen vessels and brings her body back to life. Surprisingly, ice crystals haven't damaged her muscles and skin. A few hours later, the girl regains consciousness. By noon, she starts talking. Jean doesn't know what happened. She remembers walking to her friend's house and then waking up in the hospital. What worries her most right now is that her father's car is somewhere in a ditch. As it turns out, the girl fell down and crawled on all fours to Wally Nelson's house. She doesn't remember it, but apparently her brain activated the survival instinct that night. Unfortunately, she didn't manage to crawl the last few feet. Jean passed out at the door and stayed there for 6 hours. Doctors examine the girl and understand that she's completely healthy. Soon, she's discharged from the hospital. This case isn't unique. One professor of emergency medicine, David Plummer, said he'd seen about 12 similar cases over the past 10 years when patients had survived severe frostbite. Jean returns home and finds out that she has become famous. People write about her in newspapers, want to interview her, and film documentary shows. Her case has attracted the attention of many doctors around the world, but no one has been able to find out exactly how she managed to survive. In the case of humans, such recoveries seem like an absolute miracle. But many creatures of the natural world can adapt their bodies to extreme conditions. One of them is the tree frog. These animals live mainly in temperate and tropical parts of Eurasia. Sometimes they have to contend with cold weather. Their body injects glucose into the bloodstream when they feel they're freezing, and the content of their cells turns into syrup. Sugar lowers the freezing point of water. So, tree frogs have adapted to such conditions. The water outside their cells can freeze. Their bodies can get as hard as ice cubes, but they will be alive, feeling great. Then, when it gets warmer, they fully recover. The blood fills their body and puts all their muscles in motion. But one of the most amazing animals that can withstand freezing temperatures is the ghoulish icefish. It's transparent and somewhat like a jellyfish. It swims in the dark, cold Antarctic waters. The ghoulish icefish feels comfortable there because of the antifreeze in its body. More precisely, it's a unique substance that is like antifreeze in its functions. This liquid doesn't allow the animal's cells, organs, and the whole body to freeze. There are no red blood cells in the fish's blood that transport oxygen throughout its body. This is the only vertebrate with such a superpower. There are organisms on our planet that use the cold to prolong their life. Scientists have found some of them in the ice of Siberia. Those are microscopic, multi-celled creatures, like small worms, that can live in a freezer for about 10 years. But the worms from Siberia were about 24,000 years old. The scientists transported them to the laboratory and thawed them. The worms came to life and began to multiply immediately after all those centuries of sleep. Their bodies can go into cryptobiosis. This is when an entire frozen organism has minimal vital functions. The analysis showed that the worms could stay in this mode for tens of thousands of years. And there are many such animals on our planet. Also, these creatures are some of the world's most resistant to radiation. They are practically invulnerable. Now back to our story. It's possible that Jean Hillyard's body went into short cryptobiosis. Perhaps there was some non-freezing liquid in the girl's blood, but no one knows for sure. These days, she has an ordinary job and almost doesn't remember that day. Further research on this topic can help scientists create special medicines that can help in freezing temperatures. Just imagine that you could safely go outside in the winter wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Steam would be coming off your body, and the ice under your feet would be melting. You'd feel hot inside. A dream, perhaps. But realistically, winter coat manufacturers would, of course, never allow it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the pilot of your plane speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts and stay calm. Don't worry, everything's fine. We're just falling! Ah! Okay, don't panic. Yes, we're falling, but the landing is gonna be great. And do you know why?
Because this is a video about the most incredible landings with happy endings. So, imagine this situation. You're in a giant passenger Boeing. The plane is flying from Montreal to Edmonton at an altitude of tens of thousands of feet. Weather is good. There's no turbulence. But then, you notice a strange silence. You don't understand what's happening. Exactly. The sound of engines is gone. And do you know why? Because they stopped working right in the air. The plane has run out of fuel. It'll take you a couple of minutes to get to the nearest gas station, if you fly straight down. It's a real accident that happened on July 23, 1983. That flight got nicknamed the Gimli Glider. During the fueling of the aircraft, the crew confused the measurements. They thought they were pouring American gallons, when it was actually liters. The pilots realized the mistake when they were already in the sky when the fuel had run out. They didn't panic and put the aircraft into the optimal mode to increase its flight range. One of them knew that the Gimli Air Force Base was nearby. There was a small runway there. At that moment, it was filled with some garbage and carts. The pilot contacted the base and warned them about the emergency landing. The employees of the base cleared the runway in a matter of minutes. The plane began to land very smoothly. The pilots controlled the aircraft by using its wings. They needed the last drops of fuel to brake with the help of turbines. When the plane touched down, the front landing gear broke. The landing was tough. The whole plane was shaking, and the passengers were terrified. But everything ended well. No one got hurt. On November 1st, 2011, a Polish Airlines 767 passenger plane was flying from the USA to Warsaw. 30 minutes after taking off, the pilots suddenly realized the landing gear didn't work. They warned the passengers about it. The wheels didn't come out because of some hydraulic error. Pilots remained calm and continued the flight. They almost reached the final destination and made several more attempts to deploy the landing gear. Nothing worked. They realized they would have to make a hard landing. When any airplane lands at this speed without wheels, it releases a lot of sparks, and its body heats up because of friction with the ground. In this case, the chance of a fuel tank fire is high. That's why the pilots had to circle around the airport for about an hour to burn fuel. Then, when the tank was almost empty, they started landing without the landing gear. There were sparks, metal grinding against the runway, the cabin shaking. The lower part of the fuselage turned red because of the high temperature. After sliding for a while, the plane stopped. About 231 people on board were rescued, thanks to the pilot's professionalism. Probably one of the most famous emergency landings occurred on the Hudson River on January 15, 2009. Pilot Chesley Sullenberger became a hero that day. The plane he was flying collided with a flock of geese during its departure from New York. The engines were out of order. There was only icy water under the aircraft and almost no chance of salvation. Even now, experts say that the risk of crashing the plane was very high, but experienced Chesley Sullenberger knew what to do. He did his best to calm down, focused on his work, calculated the exact angle at which the plane needed to touch the water, and successfully landed the aircraft. If he had made the slightest mistake, the plane would have lost its wings and drowned almost immediately. Chesley Sullenberger saved the lives of 155 people and became a celebrity. There was one dangerous situation in the sky on June 10, 1990. Not for passengers, but for the pilot. Flight 5390 British Airways took off from England and headed for Spain. It was gaining altitude, and the flight attendants started serving food to the passengers. At that moment, the pilots heard some noise. Condensate began to fill the cabin. Then, the glass on the side of the captain flew out of the window frame. He was pulled halfway out of the cabin because of decompression. His knees got stuck in the control panel next to his seat. The first officer grabbed him tightly by the belt. The temperatures were extremely low, and an incredibly strong wind was blowing outside. The plane began to descend, gaining speed. The autopilot shut down. The flight attendants grabbed the captain so that the co-pilot could operate the controls with both hands. The oxygen level was decreasing, so he began an emergency landing. The captain was outside the plane for about 20 minutes. And, despite the extreme conditions, he survived. The plane landed successfully. The captain was taken to the hospital and the glass was replaced. Further investigation revealed that the window had flown out because the bolts used there had been wrong. A plane runs out of gasoline. The engines stall. An aircraft crashes into a flock of birds. That's all pretty scary stuff. But what if a plane broke in half? This really happened in April 2022. A DHL Boeing 757-200 cargo plane was picking up speed on the runway. It was going to fly to Guatemala. The aircraft took off, and the pilots noticed some malfunction in the hydraulic system. They didn't fly far away, so they asked the dispatchers to allow them to land. The plane turned around and began to descend, and at that moment, its tail just broke off. The plane ran off the runway. Its hull was hot, but firefighters poured anti-fire foam on it just in time. Fortunately, none of the crew members got hurt. What caused such an accident is unknown. The company launched an internal investigation. The next hard landing occurred in the 40s. The pilot and 2 crew members were flying over Papua New Guinea. Visibility was poor because of fog and rain. But, according to the pilot's calculations, they were flying above a wheat field. He began to lower the plane. The clouds cleared, and he saw not a field, but a swampy area. They had no choice but to make a hard landing. It was a success, kind of. All 3 crew members survived, but the plane got bogged down in a swamp. It was impossible to take off, so the crew went to look for the nearest settlement. For 2 days, they were walking through the swamps, sharp tall grass, and hordes of mosquitoes. Exhausted, they reached dry land and met one of the locals. They helped the crew, took them to the village, and provided medical help. The plane was left to rot in the swamp, forgotten. It stayed there for about 30 years. Its whole body got covered with grass, mud, and moss. And the cabin was moldy. The locals loved to climb inside and play with it. Then, in the 70s, some tourists from Austria accidentally found the aircraft. They took a photo of the plane and published it in the local newspaper. It attracted the attention of many photographers and travelers from all over the world. They called the plane the Swamp Ghost. Many tourists visited it and took parts of the plane as souvenirs. In 2016, one American traveler pulled it out of the swamp and moved it to his home.
Amelia Earhart blazed a trail across the sky and left a comet tale of awe and inspiration. Her signature move? Oh, just casually zipping across the Atlantic Ocean, all alone, a feat only a person with nerves of steel could pull off. And if that wasn't enough, she whipped out another first, the inaugural solo flight from tropical Hawaii to the mainland US. However, one day, Amelia vanished during an audacious attempt to circle the entire globe in her trusty plane. Despite extensive searches, neither she nor her aircraft were ever found. Amelia's vanishing act turned into one of the most enduring whodunits of the 20th century. Now, let me tell you a bit more about the hero of our story. For starters, she came from the picturesque Kansas town of Atchison, but what made her truly special from a young age was the fact that she liked to break social molds. She liked to play basketball and tinker with cars. In between her adrenaline-filled exploits, Amelia served as a nurse's aide in Toronto. There, she started hanging around local airfields, probably trying to pick up some flying tips from the local pilots. Returning to the US, Amelia dipped her toes in pre-med at Columbia University, but traded her textbooks for a pilot's jacket after a thrilling airplane ride with a veteran pilot in 1920. That was the hook. Amelia became irreversibly smitten with the sky. Learning to fly was no small feat, but Amelia was up for the challenge. She enrolled for flying lessons soon after. To fund her high-flying dreams, Amelia got down to earth, slogging away as an administrative clerk in the city of Los Angeles. After scrimping and saving, she finally bought her own set of wings, a bright yellow plane, which she lovingly dubbed the Canary. After her flight test in 1921, she managed to snatch her first flight exhibition, wowing the crowds in Pasadena, California. When it came to setting records, Amelia was a master. She flew solo at amazing heights, a feat no woman had achieved before at that time. Next, she made a solo transatlantic flight, making landfall in a cow field in Northern Ireland. Despite her individual success, Amelia wasn't one to hog the limelight. She actively worked to bring more women into aviation. For this, she co-founded an organization dedicated to the promotion of female pilots. Today, this group still champions women in aviation across 44 countries. By 1937, Amelia was itching for another adventure. She planned a spectacular eastbound flight around the world, aiming to be the first pilot to pull off this celestial showstopper. Taking off from Oakland, California, she aimed to encircle the globe like a hawk circling its prey. This time she had a sidekick, a navigator named Fred Noonan. The duo blazed a trail from Miami to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, then to India and Southeast Asia. A tragedy struck. Amelia and Fred never made it to one of their refueling stops at Howland Island. Their last radio contact with the U.S. Coast Guard was enigmatic, to say the least. After U.S. officials greenlit a massive search, the world waited. Sadly, after 2 weeks of suspense, Amelia and Fred were declared lost at sea. Ever since, countless theories have bubbled up about their fate. The official verdict is that the pair were lost in the Pacific Ocean. This theory suggests they finished up all their fuel while searching for Howland Island and plunged into the vast ocean. Over the years, various well-equipped expeditions have tried to locate the wreckage near Howland, but alas, the ocean isn't spilling the beans. There's another intriguing theory, the Gardner Island hypothesis. Some folks reckon Amelia and Fred landed on Gardner Island, now named Nikumaroro, in the Republic of Kiribati, which was a long distance off their course. Though search planes saw signs of recent activity on the island a week after Amelia's disappearance, they found no trace of the plane. This theory, however, strongly suggests that Amelia and Fred ended up as castaways on the island and eventually met their end there. Some evidence supporting this includes artifacts like a piece of plexiglass, a woman's shoe, improvised tools, and a cosmetics jar from the era, even some suspicious bones. But despite expeditions and sniffing border collies, no conclusive proof has emerged. Now, what do Godzilla-sized crabs have to do with Amelia Earhart's disappearance? It turns out that these quirky creatures might possibly hold the keys to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. These ginormous creatures, the coconut crabs, would make you think twice before you dismiss anything as too large. They tip the scales at a whopping 9 pounds and can stretch out to a startling 3 feet. To put it simply, they make your average pug look like a snack. This theory takes us back to that tiny island in the Pacific, where Amelia supposedly made a pit stop but left no trace, Nikumaroro. When people went looking for clues regarding the famous aviator's disappearance, one rule was drilled into their thoughts. Watch out for those monster crabs. Their pincers can really pack a punch. By day, our explorers could easily steer clear of these hard-shelled creatures. They'd find the crabs lounging under the lush coconut palms, or maybe enjoying the breeze among the branches of the trees. Yes, you heard right. These critters are also good at climbing. But when the sun sets, well, that's when things get crabby. Those courageous explorers quickly learned that sleeping off the ground was essential unless they fancied a late-night claw massage. You see, these jumbo crabs are like the leading actors in this theory about what happened to our heroine Earhart and her navigator. According to this hypothesis, when the aviators missed their mark at Howland Island, they improvised a landing strip on Nikumaroro's reef. The plane eventually wandered off. Planes do that sometimes, you know, leaving Earhart alone on the island. Well, alone except for our mighty crustacean friends. By the 1940s, people had set up shop on the island and a chap unearthed some bones. However, he managed to find only 13 of them out of a possible 206, the total amount of bones in a human body. So, where did the rest of them go? You guessed it. Our robber crabs might have fancied a little midnight toy. Evidence indicates that the crabs have a tendency to clean up the island by dragging stuff back to their cozy burrows. Over the years, multiple experiments have been conducted to verify if these crabs have a peculiar hobby of bone collecting. In one such study, they introduced some bones to the island and kept their eyes peeled. Within a fortnight, the crabs had made a buffet out of it. In another exciting chapter, our researchers brought dogs from the Canine Forensics Foundation to give the area around a wren tree a good sniff. The dogs had earlier indicated that someone had kicked the bucket there. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't find any bones, but they're still hopeful. After all, if history has taught us anything, it's to never give up. These theories at least have some science to back them up. But as with many famous disappearances, there are also juicy ones. Was Amelia captured by someone? Were she and Fred secret spies who returned to the US under new identities? One of the craziest theories was neatly packaged in a book called Amelia Earhart Lives. The author put pen to paper and argued that our beloved Lady of the Skies didn't just vanish into thin air. Instead, she pulled a Houdini. And here's where things get extra zesty. According to this book, Amelia was nabbed by a foreign government. Thankfully, US officials came to her rescue. After a heroic effort, they transported her into the most clandestine relocation program ever. Her new identity? She transformed into a mysterious suburban housewife under the name Irene Bolam. But, as with all good stories, there was a twist. The hiccup was that Irene Bolam was already out there, living her life and probably whipping up a mean meatloaf in her suburban kitchen when she got wind of her new identity as a repackaged Amelia Earhart. Obviously, Irene wasn't too thrilled about this revelation, so she lawyered up and took a stand against the claims, vigorously denying this shocking identity swap.
47-year-old Kenny Veach told his family he was going hiking for 2 days. His destination? The Mojave Desert. The man wanted to revisit a cave he had discovered during one of his previous hikes. But that was the last time anyone had seen Kenny Veach. A helicopter and over 30 search and rescue teams came back empty. The hiker was nowhere to be found. Was the mysterious M Cave behind his disappearance? The oddest thing about Kenny's case is the fact that he was a seasoned hiker. He often went on solo trips to explore deserts in California and Nevada. The man was an ultralight hiker. That meant he brought only the most basic of supplies: water, food, and a tent. That's all. But this was enough for several days of camping in the desert. Kenny would rarely bring a GPS device with him. He didn't even bother to pack a compass or a map. Some would call him reckless, but he managed to get back home every single time. Kenny wasn't shy either. He had a YouTube channel where he regularly posted his adventures. He named his channel Snakebit McGee because he picked up snakes wherever he went. But Kenny also had another habit. He went into every cave he found in the desert. Now, he didn't post many videos. Kenny mostly used YouTube to comment on other people's adventures. In a comment from June 2014, the man revealed that he had discovered a mysterious M-shaped cave. It was located in the Sheep Mountains of North Las Vegas. Kenny's description of the cave is where the weird part of the story begins. He spotted it while hiking and noticed the cave had an interesting entrance. It was shaped like a perfect letter M. Kenny went up to it, but something didn't seem right. He reported that his body started to shake as he approached the cave. The vibrations were so strong near the entrance that Kenny turned back. In his own words, he was scared for his life. It must have really been something if it frightened an experienced trekker. Kenny had an impressive track record. He had been hiking for 20 years. He explored caves other people were too afraid to even enter. Once, he was bitten by a rattlesnake and had to spend a week in the hospital. On his journeys, the man found skulls of all shapes and sizes, as well as old animal traps. Kenny slept on mountain peaks under the stars. One time, he hurt his leg on a mountaintop. He had to walk 20 miles back to his truck. It was 100 degrees Fahrenheit that day, and Kenny had 1 cup of water to keep him going. Kenny Veach was a true survivalist. But this one cave was a mystery to him. He admitted that he was totally unprepared that day. He had the tools to open a can, but not to fight the mysterious force that took over his body. But Kenny wasn't a quitter. He made plans to return to the M Cave, and this time, he was going to be ready. He did so several months later, but much better equipped. But the trip turned out to be a bust. He recorded a video, but couldn't find the cave. Was that it? Was the brave explorer finally going to quit? Not by a long shot. His followers on social media wanted him to solve the mystery. So he went out into the desert for the 3rd time. He planned a short, overnight trip, but nobody ever saw him again. After 2 days, his family alerted the authorities. They quickly launched a search for the missing man. Now we come to the weird part. In one of his videos, Kenny stood in front of an abandoned mine shaft. This is where he briefed the viewers on the mission. Rescue teams reached this point and found Kenny's phone. This was 10 days into the search, but the trail soon went cold. The rescuers feared the worst. They decided to send a camera down the shaft, but didn't find anything. For a full month, no one had any idea where Kenny was. And then, the mystery deepened. An unknown woman came forward online. She claimed to be the missing man's girlfriend. The mysterious woman told the story of how she went with Kenny on hour-long hikes. She urged hikers to use GPS not to get lost. And then, a claim that shocked social media users. The woman believed Kenny's disappearance wasn't an accident. She revealed that her alleged boyfriend had some serious issues. Apparently, he had quit his job a year prior to his disappearance. Did Kenny Veach really trek into the desert to take his own life? People weren't convinced. Kenny's daughter believed her father just had an accident. In her words, he was a survivor. Was the mysterious M Cave responsible for his disappearance? Did he find someone or something he shouldn't have found there? The questions linger, and so did the theories among the online community. Fellow hikers and YouTubers were determined to find the M Cave. This would solve Kenny Veach's mysterious disappearance once and for all. In 2021, one hiker got lucky. He claimed to have found the secretive M Cave. For safety reasons, the man couldn't reveal his exact location. The cave sits somewhere near Nevada State Route 375 East. The entrance to the cave really looked like an oversized letter M, just like Veach described it. But the shape is too hard to notice from ground level. Only when you look at it from above is the M shape visible. Who knows, hikers might have been walking past it for years without noticing the cave. Even Kenny couldn't locate the entrance the second time he went looking for it. The cave wasn't very deep, but there was something odd at the entrance. There appears to have been a straight line of rocks. Did someone try to wall off the entrance? And at the back of the cave, there was an even stranger find. Small pieces of wood were scattered along the floor. They looked a lot like 2x4s that are used in construction. Was there a door here once? The hiker found a nail sticking out of the stone. It could be part of a latch that was there some time ago. But the strangest part was the writing on the wall. Hatch or Veach? It's hard to tell. The hiker that discovered the cave didn't want to stay to find out. He left the cave in a hurry. No, it wasn't because he felt a strange vibration in his body like Kenny. He just didn't want to be in a desert cave in the middle of nowhere. This is the Mojave Desert, one of the most dangerous landscapes on Earth. Could this setting better explain how Kenny Veach disappeared without a trace in 2014? The desert's nickname is well-deserved. This is where scientists recorded the hottest temperature on the planet. 134 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average temperature during summer, just 113 degrees Fahrenheit. No sweat. But you'll also need a blanket. At night, the air temperatures drop well below freezing. Talk about a climate roller coaster. And the list of dangers doesn't end there. The driest and hottest place in the United States is home to dangerous animals. Mountain lions, venomous lizards, spiders, and wasps. You name it. Any one of these animals can end the life of an unsuspecting hiker. There is a reason why Kenny always wore snake guards when trekking. And then there are mine shafts. Local authorities strongly advise hikers not to enter them. These old mines from the 1800s are highly unstable. A person can easily fall down a hidden shaft. They also have pockets of bad air, which can suffocate a person. And remember the likable wildlife? They too live in these shafts. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, and black widow spiders. Kenny Veach could have easily fallen into one of these shafts, and there would be no help for him from miles around, since Nevada is one of the least populated states. A college sophomore finished her shift at the cafeteria and decided to go for a hike. She got dressed, said goodbye to her roommate, and hitchhiked a ride to the start of a trail. The 18-year-old girl met some hikers who were coming back and asked them for directions. It was getting dark, but the student pressed on, and she was never seen again. Her name was Paula Jean Weldon, and she went missing in 1946. She was walking along a trail near Bennington, a town in southwestern Vermont. The next day, her roommate reported her missing. The authorities quickly organized a search party. Hundreds of people searched the woodlands around the trail for 4 weeks. Her college even shut down for a while so students and faculty staff could join the search. They came back empty. The girl had disappeared into thin air. Paula didn't pack a bag. She didn't take any extra clothes or money. All the evidence suggested she didn't expect to be out for more than a couple of hours. Her father was a well-known industrial engineer. He blamed the county sheriff for poorly conducting the investigation. Despite all the efforts, the poor girl was still nowhere to be found. Her case remains unsolved to this day. But this is not the first time someone went missing in Vermont's forests. A year earlier, Mitty Rivers, a lively 74-year-old man, was the guide for a group of 4 hunters. He reached a fork in the road with his son-in-law. Mitty said he would walk a short distance down one of the paths. After all, he didn't want to miss lunchtime back at the camp. But that was the last time anyone had saw him. The group he had accompanied searched for the man all afternoon before calling the police. A more extensive search followed, but it didn't yield any results. The local man was an experienced hiker, and he was well familiar with the trail. Still, he had gone missing. Firefighters, volunteers, and even servicemen couldn't find the missing person after a month of searching. All that they found was a cartridge he dropped in a nearby stream. The local authorities still haven't solved the case. Nobody knew at the time, but Mitty and Paula were just the beginning. In just half a decade, 5 people in total disappeared in this part of Vermont. Years went by, but still nobody could explain their disappearances. And that's why the area got its name, the Bennington Triangle, after the famous Bermuda Triangle, where ships and planes have been disappearing for centuries. In 1949, the most puzzling disappearance happened in the Bennington Triangle. A 68-year-old veteran boarded a local bus. He was going home after visiting his relatives in St. Albans. His family took him to the bus station, and there were 14 witnesses who claimed he was still on it at the last stop before Bennington. But he never got off the bus there. His luggage was still on the rack, and an open bus timetable sat on his empty seat. The man had apparently vanished into thin air while on a moving bus. And there's another weird thing. He disappeared on the exact same date the college student went missing 3 years ago. The youngest person to mysteriously vanish was an 8-year-old. He was with his mother while she worked on the family farm. She went to feed the pigs and left her son alone for an hour or so. When she came back, the woman couldn't find her son. The locals soon formed search parties, and the local sheriff brought in tracking dogs. They picked up the scent, but lost it suddenly at a nearby crossroads. The guy was never found. Again, there was a strange element to this story. The youngster was wearing a bright red jacket. This would have made him more visible to the rescuers. But more strikingly, Paula, the college sophomore who disappeared 4 years earlier, also had a red jacket. The final disappearance happened just 16 days after the little fella vanished from the farm. A 53-year-old woman was camping with her family in the Green Mountain National Forest. She went for a hike with her cousin, but there was a mishap. The woman fell into a stream. She decided to go back to the camp to change clothes. Her cousin thought she would join him later and continued along the path alone, but the woman never came back. In fact, she never reached their base camp. For 2 weeks, 300 searchers scouted the woods. They brought in helicopters, but found no trace of the unfortunate woman. The last disappearance in the Bennington Triangle had an ending. Not a happy one, though. In the spring of the following year, the searchers found the poor camper 3.5 miles from the original campsite. They had previously covered that spot, which made it only more mysterious. It was impossible to determine why and what happened to her. The only thing these 5 disappearances have in common is the period of time and the geographic area. 36 square miles of thick woods in the southwest of Vermont. This remote area of Green Mountains wasn't the happiest of places. Bennington and the nearby village of Glastonbury were founded as mining and logging towns. The living conditions were harsh. Near the end of the 19th century, the locals tried to rebrand the area as a tourist destination, but the mountain was unstable and a huge flood washed away their dreams of a happy life. Residents started moving out. In 2010, only 8 people lived in Glastonbury. It became a ghost town. In the late 1940s, the area was back in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. But how could these disappearances have remained a mystery for so long? Surely someone had a reasonable explanation. One theory suggests that it was a case of foul play. Maybe an unknown person was up to no good and harmed the unsuspecting people. But then there would have been a pattern, and there is none. Or maybe the elements were responsible. The college student went missing on a pleasant day at the very beginning of winter. She was lightly dressed because it was 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But in the evening, the air temperature plummeted. It was a freezing 9 degrees Fahrenheit the following morning. In this part of Vermont, the weather is quite unpredictable. It can get really windy, especially in winter. Perhaps the bad weather and the dense forest confused the missing people. Recently, a strikingly similar case of disappearance happened here. A college student got lost in heavy fog at the top of Glastonbury Mountain. When he didn't return home, his fiancée called the police. State troopers immediately went out to look for him, but it was too dark and foggy to see anything. Luckily, they found him the next morning. He got lost because of the thick fog. He managed to find his way back to the trail only after the weather conditions improved. This story had a happy ending. But could this incident explain what happened to the people who disappeared over 70 years ago? The mountains around Bennington are full of abandoned mine shafts, a reminder of the town's history. A hiker lost in fog could easily fall into one of these wells. They could have no way of getting out. The area is so remote that no one would ever find them. The second danger are wild animals. Black bears are native to New England. Local hiking clubs advise visitors to store their food in special boxes, not to attract bears. The Green Mountain National Forest sits in the middle of the Bennington Triangle. Today, this popular recreation area is within a day's drive of 70 million people. People come here to camp, hike, and ride mountain bikes. But do all of them know about the 5 mysterious disappearances? I guess I wouldn't dare venture into this remote patch of Vermont's wilderness now.
There's a heavy snowstorm. The cold penetrates his bones. His legs are almost knee-deep in snow. Experienced hunter Joe LaBelle makes his way through the forest, covering his face from the headwind. Any other person would have already fallen and screamed in despair, but not Joe LaBelle. He can survive in any circumstances and always knows what to do. Right now, he's heading to one of the villages in the far north of Canada. This small settlement is located on Lake Anjikuni. The inhabitants of this village are Inuit, indigenous people of North America. Joe hasn't eaten or drunk for a long time. He needs a good sleep and a hot meal, which he hopes to get from the hospitable Inuits. Through trees and a white haze, he notices the silhouettes of tents. Smoke is coming from some houses. Joe will probably get there in time for lunch. He reaches the village, and at this moment, the wind calms down. The blizzard has ended. The hunter speeds up and goes toward the village, located along the frozen lake. It's strange, but there are no locals anywhere. Probably everyone is just sitting in their houses, waiting out the blizzard. "Hello!" Joe says loudly, but gets no response. Oh, great! Smoke is coming out of this tent. Joe knocks on the wall, but no one opens it. He knocks a few more times and goes inside. The little tent is empty. All things are in their places. There's a piece of cloth with needles and thread on the table. Firewood is smoldering in the fireplace. It seems that people have just left this place. Joe goes into the next tent and sees the same picture. All things are in their places, but there are no people. Joe walks past the tents and sees a pit where a bonfire once burned. There's a rope above it, with the meat that the Inuit were cooking hanging on it. For some reason, they didn't eat it. Lake Anjikuni is part of a chain of waterways. Here, the Inuits fished and traded various goods. Usually, there are many people here, but now something has forced them to leave their homes. Why did they leave their things behind? And where did they go? There are no tracks around the village. All the sleds are in place. The Inuits have even left their dogs here, and dogs help them to hunt and ride sleighs. No one will leave warm clothes and dogs here when moving away, especially in severe weather. Joe LaBelle knows all this, so he concludes that something terrible has happened here. His body is shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. After going around the entire settlement, he finds not a single soul. Terrified, he leaves the village, heads for the nearest telegraph pole, and sends a message to the police. After a while, more and more people arrive. The police are trying to find traces of missing people and figure out what has happened, but there's nothing. Near the village, they find an empty grave. During the ceremony, the Inuits placed stones around the burial site. The rocks around the open pit lie untouched, which means it wasn't an animal that dug it up, but who or what needed it? About 30 people lived in the village, and they're all gone. Local residents from neighboring villages can't help, since they have no idea what has happened. The only thing that the police have noticed is unusual blue lights. In this area, the northern lights are a common phenomenon. People living here regularly see a glow in the starry sky, but the police have seen something else: pulsing blue lights. Also, other hunters have witnessed something similar. They say that some strange things were flying in the sky. This all happened in 1930. It's been almost 90 years since the disappearance of the village, and people have created a bunch of theories. The most popular of them is an attack of an extraterrestrial civilization. According to this theory, the blue lights in the sky that the locals and the police saw were spaceships. Some believe that one ominous night, these ships flew to the settlement and took away all the people. In addition to these sci-fi versions, there were also more realistic ones. Internet users have found out that Joe LaBelle didn't have a hunting license. Maybe he wasn't a professional and made it all up. But at that time, many hunters didn't have a license, so Joe's words may be true. But if we try to find out where all this information came from, we'll see that the primary sources were books and some newspaper articles from the 30s. But none of them can confirm that the mysterious story of Lake Anjikuni is true. Perhaps this entire story was made up. Now let's leave the snows of Canada and head for the hot plains of India. In this big country, there's one sinister village where people also disappeared without a trace. This happened in the first half of the 19th century. Still, locals avoid this place even now because they believe that invisible evil forces live there. Let's check and find out what happened to the village of Kuldhara. It's located in the district of Rajasthan. To get there, you can use a taxi to get to the nearest village or city. The village is located far from other settlements. It looks deserted. There are only ruins. It looks like archaeologists have recently dug this place out of the ground and left it here. But this is not an ancient city. The village was abandoned more than 200 years ago. But up to that point, this place had been thriving. Kuldhara was a large village. Local people were mostly farmers. They sold their agricultural products. And then, one night, everything changed. People abandoned their homes and stuff and ran away from there. No one knows why they did it, and no one knows where they went. Nobody has ever seen the inhabitants of Kuldhara again. Apart from tourists, almost no one comes here. The locals are sure that the village is cursed and is the center of paranormal activity. If you ask residents of other nearby towns or read the information on the internet, you'll learn a couple of legends about this place. One popular version says that people left this village because of a lack of water. However, this version doesn't explain why the residents did it overnight and left their things behind. According to another version, the villagers ran away to save the daughter of the Kuldhara chief. One local ruler fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. He threatened the locals with grave consequences if the girl rejected him. The ruler gave them 1 day to make a decision. The residents disagreed with such a requirement. As a sign of solidarity, they decided to leave the village together with the chief and his daughter. But if this is true, why did no one else see these people? They must have escaped to another settlement. In addition, they needed their things on the way there. The stories of Kuldhara and Lake Anjikuni have one thing in common. People left a comfortable and safe place for an unknown reason. A similar story happened in Ireland with a small village on the island of Achill. About 40 simple houses made of stone and straw were located along the valley of Keem Bay. The village was mentioned in documents dated back to the 1830s as a group of small buildings. But today, there's practically nothing left of it, except pieces of walls and small mounds of ground. People from other settlements don't remember this village, but we know about it thanks to the records of travel writers. They describe the incredible beauty of this place and the village in their diaries. Students of the local archaeological school tried to find the answers. They started excavations and discovered that the villagers could have left the village because of hunger or some disease.
Welcome to Gnome, a small town located in the south of Seward Peninsula on the west coast of Alaska. If you live here, I'll bet you say there's no place like Gnome. Well, maybe not. It's cold and snowy here, and no roads connect this town with other settlements. And with the onset of night, locals have disappeared here without a trace. Perhaps that's why only 3,500 people live here. Well, let's investigate this case. People disappear in cities for assorted reasons, but it was Gnome who attracted the attention of the public. From 1960 to 2004, some 24 people went missing there. That number is statistically too big for such a small population. People just didn't come home in the morning, and no one knew what had happened to them. All the locals in small towns like Gnome know each other. There are almost no strangers here, as it's difficult to get to Gnome. There are no roads and no ferry crossing. All roads from Gnome break off and lead to beautiful natural landscapes unspoiled by human mammals. You can get there and back by plane. And this is not some passenger jet, but a small biplane. Another way to get there is by snowmobile. By the way, Gnome is the ultimate point of the famous dog sled race, the Iditarod. Also, you can pay locals from neighboring villages and towns to bring you to Gnome by motorboat.
But despite this, the town has become quite famous. The frequent disappearance of people finally got needed attention.
The whole world found out about Gnome, and in 2009, Hollywood even made a movie about it. For a long time, no one could solve the mystery. The police had no clues, no witnesses, nothing. There are long, cold nights here in winter, and the air becomes so cold that a glass of water freezes in minutes. Snow can fall constantly. Therefore, if someone leaves the town at night, snow will sweep all traces away by the morning. Of course, people began to come up with their own theories. The most popular one was about someone who took people away by force. The police didn't find any evidence that some person could do it. So, if it's not a human, it could be some beast. And again, police found no evidence to support this version. After that, people started thinking that creatures from other planets caused these disappearances. Many locals were sure that the town was a popular destination for extraterrestrial spaceships. The plot of the Hollywood movie, The Fourth Kind, was based on this version. More time passed. Finally, the police and the FBI launched a large-scale investigation, and they uncovered the truth. They realized that the stories about missing people were exaggerated. The popularity of Gnome and the constant talk about fantastic things made people believe in the reality of these versions. Now, let's assume that some of the appearances were made up. But still, many people are gone. What about them? The answer is bars and harsh weather. Entertainment venues are open at night. Some locals have fun, leave the bar, and go home. At this moment, a heavy snowstorm begins. Visibility drops to zero, and the strong wind knocks you down. This way, a person might simply get lost. And that's it. The truth turned out stranger than most versions. The Bermuda Triangle is a big area in the Atlantic Ocean, so the disappearance of ships and planes there seems not so surprising. But it's much creepier when it happens on a lake. Let's visit the Lake Michigan Triangle. It's located between Michigan and Wisconsin. For a couple of centuries, terrible things have been happening here. People put the same legends around this place as around the Bermuda Triangle. They reported unexplained phenomena and saw flying objects above the lake's surface. Some believe that the triangle is a time portal. Of course, no theories have been confirmed, but strange cases have occurred on the triangle territory. One happened in 1950, when a Northwest Airlines plane with 108 passengers disappeared without a trace during a flight over the lake. Police officers saw a red light over the lake 2 hours after the plane's last communication. The aircraft probably crashed, but rescuers didn't find any passengers or wreckage. All that's left was just an oil stain on the water. Many ships and boats disappeared there, but one of the strangest cases occurred on April 28, 1937. It was midnight. One ship was sailing through this lake. Captain George Donner went to sleep in his cabin after a hard day's work. 3 hours later, the vessel was approaching the port. One of the crew members went to the captain's cabin to wake him up. The door was locked from the inside. The assistant knocked, but no one answered. When he suspected that something had happened to the captain, the assistant unlocked the door. He got into the cabin, but there was no captain there. He seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The crew couldn't find him. Since then, the eerie disappearance of Captain George Donner remains unexplained. Meet David Paulides. In 2008, he finished his career as a police officer and began to study the mysterious disappearance of people in Europe, the USA, and Canada. He found out that most people went missing in the U.S. national parks. Over the past 150 years, more than 1,100 tourists have vanished there. Many of them were experienced travelers who knew how to survive in harsh wild conditions. David has written about these mysterious vanishings. He pointed out that some of them didn't disappear, but were found alive. They woke up somewhere in the forest and didn't remember what had happened to them. The creepy detail of all these cases is that most missing persons were young. Another detail is that many went missing before hurricanes. There are too many riddles and not enough answers in this case. Then there's the Sargasso Sea in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the only sea that doesn't have shores on land. It's called the sea only because it's defined by ocean currents. Also, golden brown algae grow in this area's bottom, making it seem like an orange spot in the middle of the endless ocean. The Sargasso Sea became famous because, in the 19th century, one of the most famous phantom ships in history sailed here. In 1872, a brigantine sailed through the Sargasso Sea. Its captain spotted another ship a few miles away. He lit a signal fire, but received no response. Then the captain decided to sail closer to find out what had happened. On the hull of the mysterious ship was the name Mary Celeste. The captain of the brigantine and several crew members went on board. They walked around the deck and looked into the cabins and the hold. Everything was in place, but there were no people. The cargo and barrels remained untouched, so pirates didn't attack the vessel. The only damaged thing on the ship were the sails. They were torn to shreds. All documents except the logbook were missing from the navigator's cabin. The last logbook entry was added on November 24, 1872. The crew of the ship was never found, and this was one of many cases. In the 20th century, from the 60s to the 80s, there were many reports of empty boats and yachts floating on the sea. Also, some entire ships disappeared without a trace. All these cases still remain a mystery. According to one version, the four-sided current forms water funnels. Whirlpools can quickly pull a ship into the depths of the sea. This explains the disappearance of boats. But what about cases when the vessel is still on the water without a crew? Sometimes these whirlpools can create wind vortices. They're like little tornadoes. What if these whirlwinds are powerful enough to throw people overboard and tear the sails? Yeah, the theory seems too fantastic. So, what do you think happened? There's an unincorporated community, Paulding, in Ontonagon County in the state of Michigan. You can find beautiful nature, small houses, and dark forests. This place may seem boring to you, but wait for the night. Here, in a valley outside Paulding, you can observe a mysterious phenomenon, glowing lights of unknown origin. The first reports of the mysterious light appeared in the 1960s. A group of teenagers was walking at night along a country road surrounded by forest and noticed a strange glow ahead. The lights moved and disappeared. The teenagers told the local sheriff about what they saw. The police came to this place but found nothing. Soon, other locals found out about it. They came here out of curiosity and also noticed strange lights. The mysterious phenomenon has given rise to many rumors and legends. Some say the light comes from a swinging lantern held by a railway station employee. More precisely, his phantom. Once upon a time, there was a logging area and many trains transported wood from this place. Others think it's the light from a ghost train. Another legend says that one day, a boy disappeared in this area. His grandparents searched for him along the roadway every day. Dozens of years have passed, and their spirits are still looking for their grandson. Of course, many people don't believe in these stories and legends. Most locals are sure the mysterious light is swamp gases or a kind of northern light. The place has become so popular that people installed a special sign asking not to litter at the place where the lights are visible. While locals and tourists were speculating about what it might be, several students decided to conduct their own investigation. They proved that car headlights cause strange lights. The students brought a telescope and cameras. One of them was standing where people were watching the lights. Another was driving a car on a distant road where lights presumably appeared. The second student drove along the highway and blinked his lights, while the first recorded the result through the telescope lens. Then they wait for the mysterious lights to appear. When it appeared, students recorded it on camera through a telescope lens. The first recording, where a student filmed a car's headlights, and the recording of mysterious lights were very similar. Moreover, through the lenses of the telescope, they saw the outlines of a car passing at a distance of 8 miles from the observation site. The group posted the telescope recording on the internet. The students also explained the flickering of the lights. They said that it had been cars passing through hilly terrain. The mountain's location, air density, and temperature caused such an unusual light distortion. But many tourists and locals don't want to believe it. They're sure of the inexplicable nature of the mysterious light. Hey, you can come to Paulding and try to find the truth too. We're going to the UK and waiting for the night again. You're driving along a long highway between small towns. The moon is shining brightly, and you're moving off the main road. You pass through the forest straight to the swampy area. There's no one around. You hear only croaking frogs and rustling leaves. At this moment, a strange light rises up not far from you. It rises up over the swamp and flies in different directions. Then the second one appears. It seems that a person is holding a kerosene lamp in their hand and waving to you. It looks like they're calling, "Come here, come closer." Fortunately, you've watched enough horror movies and understand how dangerous it is to go to strange lights. But many didn't understand this. People in the past century saw these lights and thought someone was stuck in the swamp. They went there and the lights disappeared. And the rescuers couldn't return as they were stuck in the swamp. For many years, people have been observing this phenomenon. They call it fool's fire or spook lights. In the past, witnesses of this phenomenon were sure that fool's fire was mythical creatures like forest spirits or elves who lured people into their swamp kingdom. But with the advent of science, a scientific explanation appeared. Bioluminescent algae and fungi grow in such swampy places. Sometimes they glow with a blue color. From afar, this creates the illusion of a small yellow light. The water sways the algae and the wind can lift them up. Therefore, it seems like they're flying. Also, there's a lot of methane in the swamps. This is a substance that appears in wet places as a result of rotting leaves, grass, and tree branches. When methane comes into contact with air, it ignites and lifts up like a burning ball. We're in West Texas now. A long road runs through the desert. People out this way often see big lights of yellow, blue, and red colors. They flicker, merge, and fly away in different directions. This phenomenon is called the Marfa lights. They appear several times a year under different weather conditions. There's no exact scientific explanation for this phenomenon, but there are theories. Some think it's the headlights of cars passing on the neighboring highway. Others are sure that Marfa lights also appear because of the release of dangerous gas. There are no swamps here, but large reserves of oil and natural gas in this place contain methane. Sometimes it comes out of the ground and ignites. There's a brown mountain in North Carolina where you can meet the world's most mysterious and unexplainable lights. Lights appear out of nowhere and start flying around the mountain. This time, it's definitely not headlights from cars and not deposits of methane. These fireballs fly high speed over the top of the hill and disappear into the evening sky. The lights appear not only at night, but also during the day. People saw white, orange, and blue spheres. One of the witnesses claimed he had touched the flying ball while driving on the highway. He said he had felt an electric current. Now this place attracts thousands of tourists from all over the world. Fans of strange and unexplained phenomena like to come here. Someone explained the nature of these phenomena by nitrogen emissions, but scientists didn't find any emissions. Others claim this is an optical illusion. However, one physics professor decided to test the validity of this theory. He moved to live in a region where Mount Brown is located. Almost every night he spent in a tent nearby and filmed places on camera. Once, he managed to catch these strange objects. In July 2016, he filmed the mountain with two cameras from different angles, and both of them recorded a flying fireball. If it was an optical illusion or a glare-on lens, then one of the cameras wouldn't have captured the light. This proves that they are real, but their nature is still unknown. Let's finish this video with the phenomenon that sailors observe in the open sea. You can see it too if you pick the right time. It would be best if you sailed far away from any shore in a clear sky. You wait for sunset and look at the horizon. Its line is barely discernible. It seems the sky and water have joined. The sun is sinking lower and lower. At this moment, a bright green flash appears. It looks like the sun has changed color. After 2 seconds, the green light disappears and the sunset continues. Now, if you somehow miss this brief moment, you can wait for the morning. Green light sometimes illuminates the sky at sunrise. This natural phenomenon has a scientific explanation. It happens when light passes through the atmosphere at a certain angle. The air bends the shape of the sun's rays and separates them into different colors. The combination of these colors looks like a green flash. There are several varieties of this happening. The rarest of them is the green ray. Immediately after the sun sets over the horizon, a vertical green ray of light appears in the sky. This effect of a green flash occurs because of moist, foggy air. Still, it's pretty cool. You go for a hike in the steep mountains of Mammoth Lakes, California. The terrain is rugged and difficult. The icy snow makes it harder to walk. Halfway along the hike, you spot something out of the ordinary. From a distance, you spot scattered stuff lying on the rocky ground. You walk a little closer to have a clearer look and see what appears to be the remains of an airplane. It turns out that the debris belonged to record-breaking pilot Steve Fossett. Authorities had been looking for him for almost a year, No one could find him and explain what caused his plane to crash. It seemed like such an easy flight for an experienced pilot. So what could have happened to him? You see, years before this tragic event, Fossett was attempting a much riskier feat. He was trying to be the first pilot to fly around the world solo in a hot air balloon. Now, can you imagine spending 2 weeks in a tiny container just to break a world record? If you're wondering, here's what you'll need to fly around the globe: a sound navigation system, a wealthy sponsor, and tireless endurance. Even though balloons are the oldest flying vehicle, no one until Fossett managed to fly around the world with them, and it sure wasn't a breeze. It's day one of Fossett's second attempt to fly around the world in a balloon. The year is 1997, and an anxious crowd gathers in St. Louis, waiting for Fossett's takeoff. The pilot walks into the stadium with a big smile. He certainly doesn't look the part of an adventurer trying to achieve the impossible. But this is the trip of his life. To prepare, he trained to acclimatize himself to an altitude of 12,000 feet. The conditions are harsh. He's flying in an unpressurized cabin and in between the clouds. It seems unlikely he'll make it all the way, but there he goes. The balloon launches into the air. The crowd beneath is cheering and waving him goodbye. The wind of about 5 knots allows the balloon to launch. On the first night, one of his heaters breaks. It is freezing outside the cabin, but he gets through the night. Fossett's secret weapon is the world's first balloon autopilot. It gets lonely up there, and the constant need to focus makes one very soon tired. At night, he turns on the autopilot to get some sleep. It fires the burners in a computer-programmed sequence and keeps the balloon on the flight path. Fossett needs to wake up and operate the burners to change the altitude. After 3 days, a first victory. He has flown across the Atlantic Ocean. He flies solo, but a team accompanies him on the ground. They communicate mostly through email sent via satellite. At the end of the first week, the Mission Control Center receives an alarming email from Fossett. Dark clouds are mounting on the horizon. It looks like the weather is turning against him. He can see the thunderstorm from the balloon, but there is no way to predict how strong it is. Fossett is determined to fly through the clouds despite the risks. He is flying at 1,000 feet above the ground with no visibility. Somehow, he makes it through. His flight continues through Libya, Iran, and India. It looks like nothing will stop him now, but he is already exhausted. He is uncertain how much longer he can keep going. Inside the balloon, the meals are small rations, and he uses a bucket as a toilet. Unfortunately, he has lost a lot of fuel while crossing the Atlantic. Halfway through India, the balloon crashes into a tree. He flew an astounding 9,600 miles from St. Louis until his landing spot. Steve didn't achieve his goal, but he won't give up. To finally be successful, Fossett needs to change his strategy. His new plan is to fly over the southern hemisphere. It was the first time anyone would ever try that. His idea is simple. In the southern part of the globe, he would fly mostly over water. This would help him fly faster, as he would only need flight permission from 5 countries along the way. If you were on the ground as Fossett flew by, maybe you wondered what that flying object in the sky was. As he flew over Cape Town in South Africa, over 50 people reported seeing strange flying objects. Sorry to disappoint your fantasy folks, but it was just Steve Fossett and his balloon. His first attempt to fly around the world through the southern hemisphere almost worked out. He got lucky. When he reached Australia, he caught a jet stream that helped him speed up to about 115 knots. That's 3 times the speed of a gazelle. Morale was high as Fossett had already broken his distance record by flying over 13,500 miles. Under his feet, the beautiful Australian landscape is filled with deserts and dry lakes. He crossed the Australian coast at 8:22 p.m. local time, and his next expected landfall was in Chile, over 7,500 miles away. But again, a huge thunderstorm got in his way. After entering the storm, the balloon showed how fragile it was. The lightning and fierce winds tore the balloon apart. This time, he wouldn't make it through. He fell into the ocean as the balloon caught fire. A rescue team waited until morning to go look for Fossett. A Hercules aircraft rescued him from open waters. In his 6th attempt, Fossett made it around the world in a hot air balloon. The Spirit of Freedom balloon landed in Queensland, Australia, after a 2-week flight across the globe. He flew at speeds of over 200 miles per hour and journeyed over 19,263 miles. Fossett had done it. He was the first solo pilot to cross the world in a balloon. However, he didn't stop there. Soon after breaking this world record, he wanted to do the same on a different vehicle. He convinced Richard Branson, the owner of Virgin Atlantic, to fund a single jet-powered aircraft, later called the Virgin Atlantic Global Flyer. On the 8th of February 2005, the Global Flyer took off. It set out to circumnavigate the Tropic of Cancer, an incredible length of around 23,000 miles. Out of luck, or sheer ingenuity, Fossett broke yet another world record. He overcame a major fuel loss early on in the flight and made it all the way back to Salina in Kansas, where he originally departed from. Did this story make you want to hop on a hot air balloon? Fossett was the expert in aerial adventures and extreme conditions. This is why his disappearance in the Sierra Nevada mountains was full of mystery. What could have happened to take down such an experienced pilot? On the 3rd of September 2007, Fossett took off from a Nevada ranch with a single-engine plane named Super Decathlon. It was a simple, leisurely day flight that took a dark turn. Fossett never made it back to the ranch. A search and rescue team was sent to find the pilot and his plane, but they returned empty-handed. It wasn't until a year later that a hiker found some of Fossett's belongings near Mammoth Lakes. Then an aerial search located the remains of Fossett's two-seater at an elevation of 10,000 feet. The mystery was solved with the help of advanced technology. In the world's first hexagonal wind tunnel facility, experts recreated the weather conditions of the day of Fossett's flight. They were trying to understand if the downdrafts from the Sierra Nevada mountains could have brought his plane to the ground. With the help of a smaller plane replica, they made a disturbing discovery. That day, visibility was normal, but the wind currents swelled the plane like a leaf. A sudden downdraft most likely disoriented Fossett and made him lose control of the aircraft, causing him to crash directly into the mountains. The plane's engine wasn't powerful enough to overcome the wind forcing it into the ground. It turns out it was entirely out of Fossett's control. The discovery of the debris brought closure to this unfortunate case. The voyage started just like any other. The cargo ship SS Cotopaxi is making another journey to Havana, Cuba, to deliver coal. It's November 29, 1925. For Captain Meyer and his crew, leaving Charleston Port, South Carolina, it will be the last trip the ship ever makes. Its route ran through the Bermuda Triangle. 2 days into the trip, the Cotopaxi sent out a distress signal. It had got caught up in a strong tropical storm and turned over on its side. The wind was very strong and there was powerful lightning as well. Rain gradually filled the ship's hold. Then there was a bright white flash, and the ship disappeared without a trace. Later, its wreckage was found in the Gobi Desert, which is in a completely different part of the world. All 32 crew members, including the captain, were missing. Of course, the part about the Gobi Desert is fictional. For one of his movies, Steven Spielberg came up with the idea that the ship was moved there by aliens. Still, in real life, the ship was never found, and its crew really did disappear. It was officially declared missing a month afterward, and nobody could find the wreck. It seems like a classic case of mysterious things going on in the Bermuda Triangle. But most mysteries are solved sooner or later. In 2020, the Cotopaxi was found. A man named Michael Barnett had moved to Florida to study shipwrecks off the coast. One wreck in particular really caught his attention. It was much larger than the others, and the locals called it the Bear Wreck. It was about 40 miles from St. Augustine in northern Florida, but no one had ever managed to identify the rusty hull. So Michael started to do some detective work. He measured the size of the shipwreck and started working through all the information he could find. He researched hundreds of old newspapers, leafed through insurance records, and looked at artifacts found on the wreck. After hundreds of hours of hard work, Michael was sure it was the Cotopaxi. But a few years before, there had been a rumor that the same ship had been found off the coast of Cuba. The Coast Guard found the wreck of a cargo ship about the same size that looked a lot like the one lost in 1925. Michael was sure they were wrong, so he teamed up with some science journalists and kept investigating. Soon they discovered something that seemed to confirm Michael's belief. Divers found brass valves with the letters SV on them in the wreckage of the ship. Michael suggested these initials referred to Scott Valve Manufacturing Company. The headquarters of this company was in Michigan, not far from where the Cotopaxi had been built. The company had probably supplied parts for the Cotopaxi. So the puzzle seemed to be solved. The bear wreck was really the missing cargo ship. But Michael still needed to work out why the ship had sunk. Did something mysterious really happen to the Cotopaxi in the Bermuda Triangle? Later, Michael found the testimony of the ship's carpenter among some old papers. The carpenter claimed that the hatches covering the coal on the ship had been in a terrible condition before it sank. Repair work on the covers wasn't finished before the crew got the order to sail to Cuba. So if the hatch covers were still broken during the trip, water could have easily gotten on board. This water probably flooded the hold during the tropical storm. This was the real reason why the Cotopaxi went down. There was really nothing mysterious about it. It was just a mistake made by ordinary people. But this is just one example out of dozens, or even hundreds, where ships and planes have gone missing in the Bermuda Triangle. We still can't explain some of these incidents. It seems like there really is something weird going on there. One of these strange events happened in 1948. A passenger jet was headed for Miami from San Juan, Puerto Rico. It disappeared in the same area as the Cotopaxi. The 32 people on board vanished without a trace. The weather was clear throughout the flight, but experts think that when the plane was about 50 miles from the coast, it could have been hit by a strong wind that knocked it off course. Years later, a similar plane was found in the area of the Bermuda Triangle, but because no one could work out the registration, it was impossible to say for sure if it was the same one. Something even stranger occurred not long before, in 1945. 5 planes went missing all at the same time. Some trainee pilots were practicing their navigation skills, but when they'd finished, it seems they couldn't find their way back home and disappeared. Many people assume they just ran out of fuel. This seems likely, but still, the circumstances were really strange. The trainees were being supervised by an experienced pilot who had 2,500 hours of flight time. He would never have let a group of newbie pilots get that far away from their base. Even now, people still debate what could have happened. Some insist the pilots ran into something supernatural out there in the Bermuda Triangle. But who knows? And here's another freaky thing that happened there which no expert has been able to explain: time travel. In 1970, Bruce Gernon was flying a plane from Andros Island to the Florida coast. When he was at 11,500 feet, a giant cloud appeared in front of him. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and he had no choice but to fly through it. As soon as he did, the plane was surrounded by darkness. It was as if the day had turned to night in a split second. Suddenly, Bruce began to see white flashes of light around him. They were so bright that they lit up the entire sky. But they weren't lightning bolts, although he couldn't really explain what they were. The plane continued through the strange cloud for almost a half an hour. Bruce noticed that the cloud changed shape during this time. The space around the plane turned into a tunnel. Then the tunnel started narrowing. Bruce became really tense as he tried to cope with the plane's controls. All his instruments and navigation equipment were going crazy, and the electronics stopped working. Then, a white light appeared at the end of the tunnel. Just like in the movies, the plane escaped the closing cloud tunnel at the very last second. Everything was fine, but now Bruce found himself in some white fog. He had no idea where he was. Then he managed to contact ground control. He was shocked when he learned that his plane was already in the airspace above Miami. It seemed that something impossible had happened. Bruce was meant to cover a distance of about 250 miles during the flight. This usually took 1.5 hours, but he had managed it in just 47 minutes, almost 2 times faster than normal. When Bruce landed, he went to check the amount of fuel left in the tank. It turned out he'd used up a lot less than the normal amount of fuel as well. Could there be a logical explanation for the time-traveling plane? Well, records show that a large number of sunspots were detected on the surface of the sun that day, and there was a strong solar wind. This could easily have made the electronics and devices on the plane go crazy. But what about the mysterious cloud? The Florida coast is a place where 2 large air currents meet. One has a high pressure and the other is a low pressure one. This causes a lot of storm clouds in the area. But people still debate how Bruce was able to cover the distance so quickly. Some people say that some kind of mysterious dark energy was involved. Others say it was a gravitational anomaly that curves space and time. Others think that Bruce is just a fraud. We still don't know the truth. So, is there really something supernatural about the Bermuda Triangle? Or is it all just coincidences and made-up stories? The truth is that no more planes and ships disappear in the Bermuda Triangle than anywhere else in the world.
It's dark, and it's hot, and it's difficult to breathe deep underground in Karowe Mine in the heart of Botswana. It's been countless hours since your shift started, and yet another rock in your hands doesn't look promising. On the other hand, there is a tiny chance that it's the largest diamond you've ever found. You decide to inform your Canadian bosses from Lucara Diamond Corp. And bingo! The stone you found turns out to be a breathtaking 2,492 carat diamond, the second largest ever found. Now, the average engagement ring size is 1.7 carats. It means that just this diamond could be enough to supply rings for more than 1,465 brides. You can compare the size of the previous stone with the size of a fist. And the weight of this priceless giant is over a pound. Its value hasn't been determined yet, but how about we speculate a bit? So, another diamond from the same mine, called the Constellation, was sold for $63 million in 2016. And that was only 813 carats, less than a third of this new one's size. The only other discovered diamond that's larger is the famous Cullinan diamond. It was discovered in South Africa back in 1905 and weighed 3,106 carats. Now, calculate how many engagement rings we could make out of it and write the number down in the comments. Sadly, it was later cut into several smaller diamonds, and some of those pieces are now part of the British crown jewels. Interestingly, once there was an even larger diamond-like stone, a black diamond called Carbonado. It was found above ground in Brazil in the late 1800s. The coolest thing about it is that it may have come from a meteorite. The Sergio Carbonado, which is the stone's name, was broken into smaller pieces. They wanted to use it in industrial drill bits because it's one of the toughest materials on Earth. This new diamond was actually found with the help of advanced technology. The company used an X-ray system called Mega Diamond Recovery X-ray Transmission to detect the stone. This isn't the first record-breaking diamond Lucara has found at the Karowe mine. Back in 2019, they discovered the Sewelo diamond, which was 1,758 carats. At that time, it was the second largest diamond in the world. Luxury brand Louis Vuitton later purchased the gem for an undisclosed sum. And before that, in 2015, they found the Lesedi La Rona diamond at the same mine. It weighed 1,109 carats and brought the company $53 million in 2017. Diamonds aren't the only amazing thing you can find in the ground. The better and deeper you dig, the rarer objects you're likely to discover, like an ancient lipstick, for example. It might be the oldest lipstick in the world, since it's about 5,000 years old. This deep red lip paint was found in a stone vial in southern Iran. The vial actually popped up in 2001, But it took researchers until recently to figure out what it really was. Because it's not like modern lipstick in a tube. People likely applied it with a brush. Researchers are happy, since this find could give us a glimpse into what women from the Bronze Age might have done to stand out. Those from elite societies probably applied this lipstick to look glamorous and show off their high status. Now, here's the backstory of the vial. It came from a 3rd millennium BCE graveyard and was linked to the powerful Marhazi civilization. It was a big deal in that part of Mesopotamia at the time. The graveyard was uncovered after flooding, and unfortunately, looters got their hands on many items. But luckily, the authorities managed to recover this particular piece. The vial caught scientists' attention because it was different from other items they'd found. Normally, they'd come across gray, compact substances in similar containers. But when they opened this particular one, a loose, fine powder spilled out. It was dark grayish-purple in color, nothing like what they'd seen before. When the researchers analyzed the powder, they found out that it was made with hematite, which gave it a rich, deep red color. It also had other ingredients, like vegetable oils and waxes, making it really similar to what you'd expect in a modern lipstick. Apparently, back in the Bronze Age, makeup was a sign of luxury and superior status in that area. It showed off wealth and power, especially in elite circles. By the way, the researchers don't want to claim for sure that this is the world's oldest lipstick, because who knows? Something older might turn up someday. How about we move to Bulgaria right now and do some digging there? Wait, there's no need to take a spade and dirty your hands. An amazing discovery is already waiting for you. There they found a large marble statue. It's almost 7 feet tall, which might depict Hermes, a Greek deity. But the craziest thing is that it was buried in an ancient sewer for around 2,000 years. The statue is in really good shape, especially the head, which is super well preserved. There are some cracks in the hands, but overall, it's in surprisingly great condition, according to the scientific director of the excavation. And here's how they found the statue. The team was doing a routine dig in southwestern Bulgaria, near the Greek border. This area used to be part of the ancient city of Miraculous, which dates back to the 4th century BCE. While digging, the researchers stumbled upon the statue's marble foot. From there, they carefully uncovered the rest of it. It was a total surprise for them, since they didn't expect to find anything like this. Right now, the team is working on safely removing the statue from the sewer. It's really heavy, so they're using a crane to lift it out and transport it to the History Museum in Petrich. Once they restore and conserve it, the plan is to put it on display. Experts are very excited about this find. It could teach us more about the local culture in Heraclius, which isn't a very well-known ancient site. Now, if you're dreaming of making discoveries like this one but don't have a degree, don't lose heart. Even an amateur can make a scientific breakthrough. For example, you could find a Roman dodecahedron. It's this weird, mysterious 12-sided metal object about the size of a grapefruit, and no one really knows what they're used for. Historians have been scratching their heads about these things for centuries. This particular dodecahedron was discovered last summer in a farmer's field near Norton Disney, about 35 miles southeast of Sheffield. A group of volunteers had already found Roman coins and brooches in the area, so they knew the field might hold more treasures. A geophysical survey had shown areas underground where the Earth's magnetic field was disturbed, hinting that something might have been hidden there. The team started digging trenches during a 2-week excavation. On the second to last day, in Trench 4, someone spotted the dodecahedron. Richard Parker, the group's secretary, was nearby making tea when he heard the shout. He said they were all shocked because they hadn't found much metal, and then, boom, that awesome artifact simply popped up. The extra cool thing about that dodecahedron was that it was complete, which is rare. Many others found before were broken or incomplete. Plus, it's larger than usual. Roman dodecahedrons can be as small as a golf ball, but this one is closer to a grapefruit. Now, the dodecahedron is on display at a local museum. So far, over 100 Roman dodecahedrons have been found in northwestern Europe, mostly in former Roman territories like the Gallo-Roman regions. They date back to somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. Each one is a hollow metal shell, usually made of bronze. It has 12 faces, with differently sized holes on each face. Around the holes, there are concentric rings imprinted into the metal, and at every corner where the faces meet, there's a small stud. There's no writing on them, and nothing in Roman texts mentions them at all. That's why nobody knows what these dodecahedrons were for. There are loads of theories. They could have been toys, dice, mace heads, or even tools for measuring distances in Roman artillery. Some people even think they were used for knitting gloves or even figuring out dates using the stars. But most of those ideas don't really hold up, so the mystery remains.
You know, life is full of ups and downs. Hey, tell me about it. And sometimes, our mistakes can have major consequences. Even one measly typo can lead to $1 million loss. Wait till the end to discover the jaw-dropping mistake that led to a whopping $1 trillion loss. At number 1, we've got the least expensive yet irreparable mistake. We all know ancient artifacts are considered extremely valuable, and museum curators work hard to preserve them in top-notch condition, right? Well, one mistake occurred in 2015 at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo when a funeral mask that belonged to King Tutankhamun was accidentally damaged because its beard came loose. The officials reported that the restoration hadn't gone according to plan since the person in charge of it had used a very strong adhesive that wasn't appropriate for King Tut's delicate golden mask. The museum representatives didn't give any exact price for this blunder, but internet users speculate that the mask might have cost over $2 million. Number 2, and more than twice as expensive mistake here, be careful when typing something, as the world's priciest typo cost up to $5.5 million. It occurred in the aughts when a business-class fare from Toronto to Lamica, Cyprus on Alitalia was mistakenly priced at $39 Canadian instead of the usual $3,900. The error was discovered by someone at one of the websites selling tickets. They shared the news on a forum, which resulted in a rush to purchase the tickets before the mistake was corrected. Initially, Alitalia attempted to cancel the tickets that had been wrongly issued, but they eventually decided to honor them. So I'll do the math for you. For selling those wrong tickets, Alitalia made somewhere between 19,500 Canadian dollars to 78,000 Canadian dollars. But for this typo, they would have made in the range of 2 to almost 8 million Canadian dollars, which is roughly $5.5 million US dollars. Ouch! Stakes are getting higher. And number 3, we've got the London skyscraper known as the Walkie-Talkie, which initially stood out due to its cool curved walls. However, it gained notoriety for a totally different reason. When its south-facing wall, made of reflective glass, started to melt cars and start fires with the way it redirected sunlight. The building literally acted as a concave mirror, reflecting intense sunlight onto the streets below. To address that issue, they put up temporary netting and later installed a permanent sunshade, which racked up the costs in the low single-digit millions. Now, just for your information, those low single digits translate to 10 million pounds. Initially, the building cost around 200 million, so this brise soleil, that's French for sunblocker, doesn't sound that expensive compared to the full price. The movie industry is extravagant, and it's in the 4th place in our chart. Following the filming of Justice League, producers realized that a couple of scenes needed to be added. However, Henry Cavill had already begun shooting for Mission Impossible Fallout. This caused a scheduling issue, as Cavill's role in the other movie required him to grow a mustache. Coordinating the reshoots cost about $25 million, and a visual effects team had to be hired to remove Superman's mustache in those scenes. There was a suggestion to pause production so Cavill could grow back his mustache, but Warner Brothers would have to pay $3 million for the scenes. Unfortunately, Paramount had a deadline to meet, and the plan fell through. Production was further delayed when Tom Cruise got injured. By the time everything got back on track, it was too late to save Superman's upper lip. This unknown music band, Silver Beetles, is in the 5th place in our chart. We're halfway through. So, those poor Silver Beetles faced numerous rejections before finally securing a record deal in 1962. At the time, many producers believed that guitar music was on the decline. However, once Beatles, you heard me right, were signed, their popularity soared to new heights. The merchandise featuring the band included items like lunchboxes and inflatable dolls, generated around $50 million in retail sales in 1964 alone. Now, imagine what those producers who declined them felt when they bought the Beatles merchandise, pretty much like everyone did back then. The stakes are almost tripled now, and this mistake cost $125 million. The thing is, NASA lost a Mars orbiter due to a simple mistake made by a Lockheed Martin engineering team. The team used English units of measurement, while NASA's team used the metric system for a crucial spacecraft operation. This mix-up prevented navigation information from being transferred between the two teams, ultimately leading to the loss of the Mars Climate Orbiter. So, NASA's money is floating somewhere in space now. Still, they don't give up and plan to investigate the incident through internal and independent review panels to prevent similar errors in the future. Despite the setback, upcoming missions to Mars will continue as planned, with more focus on ensuring proper communication among teams using the same measurement system. Ooh, you think? Number 7, and now we're counting billions. A French railway operator will need to adjust over 1,000 stations because the new trains they ordered are too wide for many platforms in France. This mistake has already cost $20 billion as they quietly work on making the affected stations wider. Around 1,300 out of 7,800 stations in the country were found to be too narrow for the new trains, but 300 of them have already been widened without much public attention. The new trains were ordered after consulting with the railway network operator, who only provided measurements for stations built in the past 30 years. This left out many older stations, like those in rural areas, causing the width issue. SNCF, the railway operation, claims that only a fraction of the trains are affected. But some sources suggest all the new trains are facing the same problem. Number 8 mistake happened in Dubai and is around the same price, somewhere around $20 billion. The biggest shopping center in the Middle East had to be partly cleared out because of a leak in the shark tank at the aquarium. A video posted on a Dubai newspaper's website showed water spilling out of the tank and onto the mall floors. Visitors were kept away as maintenance crews worked to fix the leak, which turned out to be a small break in the glass panel behind the tank. Luckily, the aquarium's maintenance team quickly sorted it out, and the company that owns the mall reassured everyone that the leak hadn't harmed any aquatic animals. Really? $20 billion for that? Wow. This mistake turned out to be extremely costly, like over 7 times more costly than the Dubai leak. It now seems impossible, but Netflix used to be a struggling startup trying to find investors to move forward with their business. They started off competing against Blockbuster in DVD rentals through mail delivery, and have since grown into a major player in the entertainment industry. Netflix's co-founder recently looked back on a crucial moment in the company's past, where he tried to sell Netflix to Blockbuster for $50 million back in 2000. Today, Netflix's value has surpassed $150 billion. Now, are you ready for a $1 trillion mistake? Well, if you take a second to think about it, you can probably come up with the answer yourself. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, it's Apple. Over the years, we've learned a lot about the Apple crew. You know, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and how they totally changed the game in the tech world. But did you know there was actually a third founder, Ronald Wayne, who used to own 10% of the company? Yeah, he ended up selling his shares to Jobs and Woz for a measly $800 after just 12 days of being a shareholder. Yikes! In hindsight, it was probably not the best move, especially now that Apple is valued at $1 trillion. Hey, and what's your most costly mistake? It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph Uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidor didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting.
Just like Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Captain Kidd was a pirate who sailed around looking for treasure. Only he was less charming and more dangerous. As the legend goes, he was so protective of his loot that he is still out there, guarding it as a ghost. William Kidd, who became famous as Captain Kidd, was born around the 1650s. He told people his birthplace was Dundee, Scotland, but many people think it was a lie. When he was a young man, Kidd settled in New York City. He became friends with powerful people, including 3 governors. Some stories suggest he started his maritime adventures as a rookie on a pirate ship before becoming a well-known sailor. By 1689, Kidd had already become part of a pirate crew. When they were sailing in the Caribbean, Kidd and other men on the ship rebelled. They overpowered the captain and renamed their ship Blessed William, making Kidd the new captain. Kidd gained experience and even assisted certain countries during battles. Once, the governor didn't pay the crew for their services, and Kidd and his team attacked a French island, Marie Galante, and looted it, collecting a huge amount of money. In 1691, Kidd married a woman named Sarah Bradley, who was one of the richest women in New York. She had been married twice before him and was a widow. Her money came as an inheritance from her previous husbands. A few years later, the man in charge of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire asked Captain Kidd to go after some pirates. This wasn't just any request. It had the support of the king and carried a lot of importance. If Kidd had said no, people would have thought he was disloyal and looked down on him. This was the start of the journey that made Captain Kidd famous as a pirate and a character in stories. This trip was funded by a few noble lords who were some of the most powerful people in England at that time. The king himself signed a letter that gave Kidd permission to be a privateer, which is basically a pirate who can do all piratey things with a legal license. This letter said that 10% of the treasure he may find would go to the king. To get some extra cash for the trip, Kidd had to sell one of his ships, the Antigua. And for his special voyage, Kidd got a new ship called the Adventure Galley. It was perfect for chasing pirates, with 34 cannons, oars, and a crew of 150 men. The oars were handy because they let the ship move even when the wind wasn't blowing. Kidd was very picky about his crew, choosing only the best and most loyal officers. But as the Adventure Galley sailed, something strange happened. Kidd was expected to salute a Navy yacht, but he did not. So, the Navy yacht fired a shot to show Kidd he needed to pay respect. But Kidd and his crew decided to do the opposite. They turned around and slapped their backsides in disrespect. After this, the Navy captain got angry and took many of Kidd's crew members to work for the Navy, even though privateer crews were usually free from this obligation. Kidd, short of men, sailed to New York, where he captured a French ship. To replace his lost crew, he hired a lot of known criminals, some of whom were likely former pirates. In September 1696, Captain Kidd set sail for the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. His journey faced troubles right from the start. Cholera caused many of his crew to get sick and pass away. Even worse, their brand new ship started to have lots of leaks. Kidd was also on a mission to catch some pirates in the Indian Ocean, but he couldn't find them. As his big plan started falling apart, Kidd got desperate to make money to cover his costs. The worst happened a few months later. Kidd attacked one of his own crew members because the man wanted to board a Dutch ship, but it would have been considered an act of piracy. The man passed away due to his injury. Things were going downhill fast for Kidd, and a Royal Navy officer declared him a pirate. Kidd changed his ship's flag to look like it was French and captured a big Indian ship called the Quedagh Merchant. It was loaded with valuable stuff like silk, gold, and silver. Kidd decided to keep the Quedagh Merchant and sailed to Madagascar. There he met another pirate named Robert, who had taken Kidd's ship years ago. There are two different stories about how it went. One says Kidd was nice to him, and the other says Kidd was scared and wanted to wait for his backup to attack. But whatever the case, most of Kidd's crew left him to join Robert. Kidd decided to give up and go back home. He left his old ship, the Adventure Galley, behind as it was falling apart. Before he set it on fire, he took all valuables from it and boarded the Adventure Prize. The British authorities had a law that offered pardons to pirates in the Indian Ocean, but they made sure Kidd couldn't get one. They didn't want to forgive him because he was connected to some powerful people in England. Kidd found out he was wanted as soon as he reached Anguilla, and he couldn't use the pardon. The government had changed, and new leaders wanted to use him to make their rivals look bad. They thought Kidd would spill the beans about his powerful supporters. However, Kidd refused to reveal any names, believing that his friends would come to his rescue, but they failed him. Some say he might have escaped punishment if he had talked, but he didn't. Kidd was sent to London to stand trial before the High Court of Admiralty. They accused Kidd of piracy on the high seas and the accident with a crew member. While he waited for his trial, he was locked up in the notorious Newgate prison. They found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to public execution, though many questioned if the evidence was enough for such a harsh verdict. He was executed on May 23, 1701. His body was displayed over the River Thames for 3 years as a warning to anyone thinking about becoming a pirate. Some of Kidd's crewmen were supposed to be punished in the same way, but they were set free before their executions. The loot Captain Kidd had collected over the years made people believe he must have hidden it somewhere. This sparked loads of treasure hunts in different places. Some people say that Kidd might have hidden the treasure on the Rahway River in New Jersey, just across from Staten Island. Evidence suggests that Captain Kidd hid a small stash of treasure on Gardiner's Island, near New York. It was supposedly found and sent to England as proof against Kidd in his trial for piracy. Around the Bay of Fundy, people have been looking for Kidd's treasure since at least 1875. They believed he hid it there during his time as a privateer. There's a place on the island called Money Cove because of these stories. Considering how Kidd met his sad and unfair fate, it's not surprising that people have claimed to see the ghost of Captain Kidd. Some people reported spotting him at Trinity Churchyard as if he was searching for his own grave. There's also a story of 2 men who tried to look for Kidd's jewels in 1825. They actually found a treasure box. But before they could crack it open, the ghost of Captain Kidd himself rose up from the ground next to the treasure chest. This sight was so terrifying that it made the men pass out. Both of them claimed to have seen a truly creepy figure emerge from the earth. It breathed out sulfur fumes and seemed to glide over the ground. Thankfully, there is no solid evidence that confirms these ghost stories.
What if I told you there was once a guy who sold coal to Newcastle, bed warmers to the tropics, and stray cats to the Caribbean? It all sounds like some good material for a stand-up comedian sketch, but it was, in fact, the true story of Timothy Dexter. He was born in the winter of 1747 in Malden, Massachusetts. The family's financial situation was far from perfect, so they couldn't afford to give the boy a decent education. At the age of 8, he dropped out of school and started working at a farm. At 16, Timothy became a tanner's apprentice in Boston. This job was considered a lower-class one, but the salary was pretty good. His teacher had unique knowledge of how to work with Moroccan leather, which was a hit among the fashionistas of those times. At 21, Dexter was ready to start his own business, making leather gloves and moose-hide breeches. Things got rowdy in Boston after the new taxes and the famous Tea Party. But Timothy didn't want to leave the city. His loyalty was soon rewarded as he met a wealthy, newly widowed Elizabeth Frothingham. She fell in love with Dexter, and they got married. Mr. Dexter was thrilled to have moved to Boston's posh Charleston neighborhood, but the neighbors didn't share his desire to be friends. Nobles like John Hancock and Thomas Russell, who was then one of the richest people in the country, didn't see Timothy, an uneducated guy who had married into money, as their equal. Our hero couldn't accept that and decided to prove to them that he was worthy of respect. First, he decided to secure a position in public office. He submitted dozens of petitions to his hometown governing body. Finally, they agreed to create a post just for him, Informer of Deer. His task would be to watch over the deer population in town, although the last fawn had left the nearby woods 19 years before. Still, Mr. Dexter loved his new position and moved on to the second part of his master plan, to become rich. He opened a shop in the basement of his wife's house and managed to save several $1,000s. In 1775, the Continental Congress issued around $250 million worth of a new paper currency, the Continental Dollar. Shop owners refused to accept this new money, yet even more of it was printed, and it soon flooded the market and went down in value. They even coined a new expression, not worth a continental. Dexter's wealthy neighbors wanted to look good in the public eye and support the common folk by buying some of those nearly worthless bills from them. Our hero decided it was a great idea, and so he took all his and his wife's savings and bought tons of those depreciated bills. And his risk totally paid off. Once the United States Constitution came into the picture, holders of Continentals were able to trade them for 1% of the original value. Because Dexter had a lot of that money, it was enough to make him extraordinarily rich. He was sure that would be enough to become friends with the neighbors, but they rejected him again. Mr. Dexter decided the problem was their character and not him, and moved to the coastal mercantile town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, with his family. He now had enough funds to buy a fleet of shipping vessels, a stable full of horses, a fancy chateau with a sea view and lavish furniture, including a coach with his initials. Dexter loved it when people addressed him as Lord. He hired the best artists of European architecture to create over 40 giant wooden statues to adorn his property. Among them, there were figures of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and of course, Timothy Dexter himself. The plaque under his statue described him as the first in the East and in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world. All those statues cost as much as the entire estate and made people stare. Dexter's wife was so embarrassed he even moved out, and the house turned into a palace of frivolity. His new neighbors didn't enjoy his company and were hoping they could make Dexter go bankrupt with their bad financial advice. One of them suggested that Dexter sell warming pans to the West Indies. Warming pans were a real hit in the 18th century, made out of brass with long handles and were used for keeping the bed warm. But the West Indies? Yeah, that place where it's always warm. Well, it didn't stop our hero, and he purchased 42,000 of those, loaded 9 shipping vessels with them, and set off on a journey with his neighbors chuckling around. Once he arrived in the West Indies and figured no one needed warming pans there, he rebranded the goods and sold them as molasses ladles to owners of sugar plantations. Everyone wanted to buy at least 3 or 4, and he made some really good money with a markup of 79% for each item. He also managed to sell wool mittens in the same place. Asian merchants bought them for export in Siberia. So, selling a heating device to the tropics worked out well. But no one would carry coal to Newcastle, right? One trader managed to convince Dexter that anthracite coal was in huge demand in Britain's largest coal mining town. He had no idea about that little detail and set off to the UK. When he arrived, though, the workers were on strike, and he managed to sell coal to Newcastle with a big markup. Dexter returned to his chateau as a winner with a barrel and a half of silver. Then he made another eccentric business decision and shipped winter gloves to the South Pacific. He arrived there just in time to run into Portuguese sailors who saved the day and bought the gloves on their way to colder climates as they'd need them there. He also managed to market 340 tons of whale bones he had stocked up on to monopolize the market as ladies' corsets, collar stays, buggy whips, toys, and typewriters, and made some good profit. Once, Newburyport's stray cat situation went out of control. The town meeting voted to get rid of them all, but Dexter offered to buy the cats and take good care of them. And yes, he found a way to sell them at a premium price as well. Warehouse owners in the Caribbean were desperately looking for a solution to their rat problem. It might seem like his choices were just eccentric and emotional, but biographers who analyzed his decisions later believed he actually developed a strategy. Dexter came to realize his key to success was to find out which goods were missing from the market, stock up on them to the brim, and then sell them at the price of his choice. The choice of those goods was often odd, but it all worked out in the end. When he was 50, Dexter wrote a book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, in which he complained about those in power of country and his wife. The book had nearly 9,000 words, but not a single punctuation mark and his own unique spelling and capitalization. One section opened like this. He published the first edition for his own money and distributed the book for free. And yes, it became a hit and was reprinted 8 times. In the second edition, Dexter added an extra page of 11 lines of punctuation marks. It was his response to all those people who complained there weren't any of those in the first edition. He offered them to feel free to insert the signs wherever they wanted. Dexter really cared what other people thought about him all his life. He even staged his own passing away to see who'd show up at the ceremony and how they behave. He revealed that it was all a joke when he noticed his wife wasn't mourning enough.
Remember when you were little and you used to think fairy tales were real? I have some news that is about to make your inner child very happy. A little birdie told me that the couple that might have inspired the Beauty and the Beast was real. The only thing we need to find out is if the movie was really based on their story or not. How about you be our guest as we dive deeper into the origins of this beloved Disney movie? The year is 1537, and our story begins in the sunny center of Europe, the Canary Islands. The Canaries are home to outstanding natural attractions, and Canarios, the people who are born there, live their daily lives in the archipelago's pleasant climate. That year, a certain gentleman was born on the Canaries, and his destiny would be different from those of his fellow islanders. Meet Pedro Gonçalves. Pedro was born into a typical family, with a very rare congenital condition called hypertrichosis. If you've never heard of this before, hypertrichosis is a condition that can make someone look like a real-life werewolf, minus the howling part. It allows for hair to sprout excessively in places where hair wouldn't normally sprout. If in 2023 we still aren't sure of the causes of this disease, imagine people all the way back in the 1500s. Dermatologist Sarah Taylor says that throughout history, there have only been 50 documented cases of this condition. This is how rare Pedro's case was. The thing is, the excess facial hair made people look at Pedro differently. Records say he was called a wild man and was highly mistreated when he was a youngster. 10 years later, Pedro was put on a ship and sent to France as a gift to King Henry II. The king was about to be crowned, and it was normal for people to shower him with all kinds of presents. Little Pedro disembarked in the French city of Fontainebleau, where he moved into the king's castle. The entire court took interest in the boy as soon as he arrived. The castle's academics and doctors asked to study him closely, hoping to figure out if he was really a wild man. Soon enough, they understood that Pedro was just a 10-year-old boy. The boy even told them his name, which the French then changed to Petrus Gonçalves. The court communicated the news to King Henry II, and the king immediately ordered that the boy be given a proper education. As you're probably already thinking, Petrus's life changed completely at that moment. Just like Belle's life changed once she got trapped in the Beast's castle in the beloved Disney movie. But life in King Henry II's palace was very different for Petrus than it was for Belle. If the Disney princess got to befriend talking ceramics and wear beautiful silk dresses, Petrus needed to go to school on a daily basis. To the surprise of the court and his teachers, the boy excelled in Latin, which is no easy feat. During his life, he even became fluent in 3 languages. Now, Belle and Petrus did have one thing in common. They both had to learn etiquette. Remember how Lumiere did his best to teach Belle the ways of the palace? Perhaps we can say that it was similar for Petrus, except for the fact that it was probably a human that taught him what he needed to learn. The king became impressed, and soon Petrus was a frequent presence in the court. For the first time in his life, he would dress like a nobleman and take part in the court's social activities. But still, records show Petrus was never considered fully human due to his congenital disease. In 1559, King Henry II passed away, and Catherine de' Medici, his wife, took over the palace. If in the Disney version of the tale there is an infamous evil witch that curses the prince to become a beast, in this story, there is a not-so-kind queen. As far as records show, Queen Catherine de' Medici decided to arrange a marriage between Petrus and another gal also named Catherine. Let's call her Kathy, so we don't get too confused. The thing is, the queen didn't tell Kathy of Petrus's congenital condition, which doesn't sound too cool to me, huh? Kathy was the daughter of one of the court's royal servants, and as was the practice back then, when a queen told you to marry someone, you usually did. So Kathy didn't question the fact that she hadn't met Petrus, or knew nothing about him before the wedding. One can only imagine Kathy's surprise when, on her wedding day, she discovered who Petrus really was. There is no official record of her reaction, although rumor has it that Kathy wasn't too happy initially. But this story has a plot twist that Queen Catherine could never have imagined, and this plot twist is the cheesiest of them all: love. Like in the Disney fairy tale, Beauty, aka Kathy, found that true love was hidden way deep beneath the surface, and that Petrus's exterior appearance was only a small aspect of who he was. Perhaps Queen Catherine could never have imagined that the real Beauty and the Beast would be married for nearly 40 years. They would even have children. Nobody knew if the couple's children would be born with Petrus's condition, so it was a surprise when their first child was born without it. The couple had 7 children in total, and 4 of them did inherit Petrus's hypertrichosis. The Gonsalves family became a huge attraction in France's court. They became known as the Wild Family and spent the rest of their lives touring through Europe. Natural scientists were interested in studying the Gonsalves children, trying to better understand the ones born with hypertrichosis. Many portraits were painted of the family during the years they toured the European continent, but many say that they were always seen as an attraction rather than regular human beings. This makes one wonder, did Petrus and Kathy get their happy ending? We know that all Disney movie characters live happily ever after. But how true was that for the real-life Beauty and the Beast? Records were so fascinated with figuring out if Petrus was human or a wild man that there is not much about his life beyond that fact. In the original tale that inspired the movie, Beauty and the Beast also find a happy ending. Written by Gabrielle Suzanne Villeneuve in 1740, the original tale is said to be inspired by Petrus and Kathy's story. But maybe this tale is really as old as time and was born even before Petrus. You see, historians have collected over 23 variations of the Beauty and the Beast story around the world, and over 162 versions of the animal bridegroom story archetype. If this word doesn't mean anything to you, let's take a step back for a second. Fairy tales usually follow some archetypal structure. This means that they tend to reflect the human psyche, as a way for us to understand some of our behaviors and feelings. In fact, some fairy tales should be called just tales, as there is nothing fairy-like about them. If you've ever read the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen, you know what I mean. The animal bridegroom story trope usually shows a woman marrying an animal-like human that turns out to be a prince living under a curse. And some say this trope dates all the way back to the 1500s. The Disney movie never sets a historical date for the Beauty and the Beast story. From the outfits worn, some people say it's set around the 1700s, which would be the epoch that Villeneuve's tale represents, rather than Petrus's time period. All we know is that if this was inspired by the Gonsalves family life, Villeneuve twisted quite a few things. If in the movie, Belle breaks the Beast's curse with the power of true love, in real life, that's not what happened to Petrus. There was no evil witch cursing him. He would never be able to get rid of his condition. The turning point of this story would be if society would have accepted him as he was, and perhaps never have called him a beast to begin with.
That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and